Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the movie of what if Dr. Deku transports himself millions of years into the past to discover dinosaurs. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. World-famous scientist and engineer Dr. Izuku Midoriya slowly came back into consciousness to the feeling of something tugging at his curly green locks. As he regained awareness, he felt a hard surface pressing against the left side of his face. He figured he fell off the bed again onto the hardwood floor. His lips were cracked and dry. He made a small pained noise as he stretched his sore body, bones making loud pops and cracks. He slowly rolled onto his back, eyes still closed. He felt like he'd been hit by a bus for some reason. He could deal with sleeping on the floor if it meant he didn't have to move right now. Unfortunately for him, that wasn't going to be an option. He felt another tug on his hair but ignored it. It couldn't be the first time his cat had woken him up this way. However, the next thing he felt was what definitely wasn't his cat as he felt two fingers enter his mouth, forcing his lips apart. In a panic, he jerked his head away while spitting out the unwanted foreign objects, heart pounding wildly in his chest. He slowly blinked open his eyes, pupils contracting rapidly to allow the bright rays of sunlight in, then squeezed them shut again. His headache was suddenly worse. He most definitely didn't remember drinking last night, so why did he feel like absolute garbage? He gave it a few seconds before he tried opening his eyes once more. The sight that greeted him when he fully opened his eyes made all of the sleepiness and confusion dissipate immediately. Before him was a very tall, broad-shouldered man with wild ash blonde hair wearing what looked to be brown rags and furs thrown over his body haphazardly. In any other circumstance, Dr. Izuku Midoriya would have thought this man was incredibly handsome, especially with his defined features, sharp red eyes, and muscles in just about every place possible. However, this wasn't any other circumstance, and he found himself frozen with fear at the realization he had no clue who this person was or how he even got into Izuku's room. It didn't take him long to make an even more horrific realization. They were not in his bedroom, but rather in what seemed to be the middle of a forest. The only logical explanation would be that they are somehow far away from the city and this man kidnapped him. Before he could think too hard about it, the stranger poked him in the eye, then laughed loudly when Izuku squeaked from the surprise pain of being jabbed in the eye. The laugh sounded raspy and grating to his ears. Panic filled him. He has to do something. He had to get away and find help. Without much thought, he kicked out his leg to knock the man off his feet from his squatting position, then quickly scrambled away. He stumbled slightly as he tried to stand, but eventually regained his balance enough to begin sprinting away. He was breathing erratically, and his heart continued to pound furiously as he weaved through the trees, jumping over roots and trying to put as much distance as possible between him and that monster of a man. He has no clue where he was or which way is what, but he doesn't care. He needed to escape and put as much space as he could between himself and that brute. Unfortunately for him, his luck ran out sooner than expected. Just as he thought he had made some progress, his foot snagged on a tree root, causing him to fall flat onto the ground face first. He gasped out a pained groan as the air left his lungs and blood dripped down his nose onto the leaf-covered forest floor. His right ankle throbbed painfully as he rolled to his back. As soon as he managed to roll himself over, he froze again, realizing the man was towering above him and looking down at him with his piercing crimson eyes. His mouth was turned downward and brows were pulled into a frown. Suddenly, Izuku screamed as loud as his lungs would allow, desperately hoping there were other people nearby to hear him. Maybe they were not far from a running trail. Someone surely would hear him yelling if that was the case, and he can hopefully be saved. Much to his surprise, the man jumped backwards in fright and yelled along with him, also in fear. The man scurried away out of sight, and Izuku almost couldn't believe his eyes at how fast the man disappeared. Why did he look so scared? Izuku was the one who should be frightened. Izuku stopped screaming after noticing how quiet everything became again. He waited a moment, holding his breath as he strained his ears to see if he could pick up any movement nearby. After deeming it safe, he slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, looking around warily to be sure he was actually alone this time. Unfortunately, he was not. The man was crouched several feet away, attempting to appear inconspicuous, peeking out from behind a large bush. It was the strangest behavior Izuku had ever seen from someone. After regaining his breath, he stared back at the man, feeling baffled by his actions. "I can clearly see you. Who are you? What am I doing here? If this is some joke, it isn't funny," he yelled at the man, trembling hands fisted by his sides in anger as he scowled at the brute. When he received no response, he huffed frustratedly at the absurdity of this all. He took another deep breath in an attempt to calm himself and attempted to speak more calmly this time. "Is it money you want? Name your price. Just please let me go and I promise I will never speak a word of this to anyone." "You have my word." The stranger only continued to stare. Izuku watched the stranger's head titled like a dog, likely trying to comprehend what he said. Izuku held up his hand, pressing his thumb, forefinger, and middle finger together, rubbing to mimic cash money. Money, cash, dollars, coin, yen, francs, euros, whatever you use. Please just let me go. Please. Izuku's voice cut short as he began crying loudly, chest heaving and body racked with sobs. He doesn't want to die, and this whole situation was the most confusing thing he has ever dealt with in his life. He covered his face with his hands, knees pulling to his chest. His nose stung and he could taste copper. He probably looked pathetic, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to be back at his apartment in his bed. He heard movement, twigs snapping, leaves crunching before he finally heard light footsteps coming towards him. He assumed the brute was coming closer to possibly kill him. He peeked between his fingers to see the stranger cautiously crawling over, movements reminding him of an ape. When he was just within arm reach, he hesitated momentarily, before reaching forward and setting down a large stick in front of Izuku before quickly scurrying away, returning to crouching behind the bush. Izuku stared in stunned silence as the brute looked on expectantly, patiently waiting for Izuku to notice the offering. Izuku was unsure how to proceed. Did this man have some type of twisted fantasy playing out that he just couldn't understand? It took him several minutes to realize he had nothing to lose since his death seemed imminent anyways. So he slowly reached for the stick and brought it closer to look over. It was definitely a bone. He dropped it like it burned his hand and gagged in disgust, wanting to expel what little contents resided in his stomach. Now he was certain the man had plans to eat him or something. There is no logical reason for such a cruel person to kidnap him just to play with him like this. Just as the panic was threatening to take over, a sudden strong gust of wind blew past him, and he became aware of just how cold the weather was around them. The breeze made him shiver uncontrollably as he glanced down at himself, seeing that his attire certainly wasn't suited for a hike through a wooded area in cool, fall weather. He was wearing only an oversized t-shirt and boxer briefs. This person must have kidnapped him in his sleep after sneaking into his bedroom or something. That would explain why he couldn't remember anything about how he ended up here. Within an instant, his memories came flooding back to him. The last thing he remembers doing was pulling an all-nighter in his home laboratory, working on his newest invention, a machine capable of time travel. He'd successfully managed to travel hours back in time, but only for a few seconds before he was transferred back into the present. He hadn't progressed any further than that. He had stayed up past midnight and tinkered with the machine for hours to no avail, so he finally gave up to crash for the night but was stopped by sparks from inside the machine. He stepped inside to check it out, and it was then he realized a rat had chewed through some of the wiring, causing a small electrical fire. In a panicked attempt to stomp it out, he tripped and fell forward onto the lever. Shit. This meant only one of two things. He either traveled back in time to some random point in prehistoric times, or he died in that accident, and this was some odd version of purgatory. He wasn't sure which was the worst-case scenario. The man reappeared again, crawling over and breaking him away from his thoughts, and presented some kind of moldy-looking, rough rock which he set gently beside the bone before running off to hide behind the bush once again. Izuku stared blankly at the rock, his brain having difficulty comprehending the events unfolding before him. Having nothing better to do, he reached forward and picked up the rock, turning it over to examine it more closely, and noted the shiny green flecks peeking through the mostly dull, gray surface. He realized the green hue wasn't mold at all, but rather some form of green mineral embedded in the stone. He looked back to the man hiding behind the bush with curiosity. What happened next changed his mind about the man possibly murdering him, and made his heart soften towards the man. The man pointed to the green rock before raising his index finger to point at his own hair. It took a second to piece together what the man meant, but when it clicked, his jaw went slack. The man was indicating that his hair is similar to the color of the mineral. The man was trying to communicate with him, but Izuku knew he couldn't let his guard down just yet. He sniffled, wiping his eyes and nose against his shirt before clearing his throat, with his voice still shaky. He spoke to the man, pointing at the rock and then his hair, trying to confirm his suspicions. Green rock, green hair, green, he said simply, then repeated, adding extra emphasis to the word. The man tilted his head again, his brows pulling together like he was confused. He snatched a green leaf off the bush in front of him and held it up, then pointed at Izuku's hair. Then he said something. It was unlike anything Izuku had heard from another person before. It was hard to decipher what the man said, sounding more like a grunt than words, and certainly not Japanese. It made sense that the man would not know any modern languages, though. He may not even be speaking any language known today. His train of thought was interrupted when the man began cautiously approaching again, crawling slowly and deliberately. When he made it close to Izuku this time, he sat back on his ankles and studied Izuku intently. Izuku thought for sure he was about to be attacked, but instead of grabbing or strangling him, the man raised a finger towards his hair, seeming unsure whether or not to touch it, which surprised him. It appeared the man wanted permission to touch his hair. Izuku swallowed thickly. Was this really happening? Was his entire world and life before this completely gone? It was a possibility, but an unlikely one. His invention hadn't sent anyone back in time permanently yet. Hell, his trips back in time didn't even last close to a minute before zapping him back to the present. He figured surely this had to be temporary as well, even if it had already taken him much further back in time than he'd ever dreamed of and already lasted much longer than ever. While he was here, he may as well make the most of it and learn as much as possible to bring back with him. It would also be a good idea to not get on this brute's bad side and get himself killed while here. Izuku gave the man a tentative nod, indicating it was okay, and the man wasted no time bringing his hand forward to poke and prod at his hair. He remained perfectly still and didn't object. It was strange to have a stranger touching his hair like this, but considering the circumstances, he can't exactly be upset over it. The man combed his fingers through it, pulling pieces through the gaps between his fingers and thumb, twisting the strands between them. Then he grabbed a fistful at the crown of Izuku's head, tugging hard and leaning close to inspect it. Izuku yelped as his scalp was pulled hard. His panic escalated as he thought this was surely how he was going to die, getting scalped. Why didn't he think this through? He felt himself trembling as the tears threatened to spill again. However, after letting out a distressed whine, the man released his grip, and to Izuku's surprise, a look of concern and fear flashed on the man's face. Izuku placed his hand gingerly atop his head, giving a sheepish huff of a laugh. He decided to speak up, despite knowing the man likely wouldn't understand. Ouch, he voiced simply, hoping to convey the message that his scalp was sensitive and shouldn't be pulled so roughly. It worked, because the man reached forward again, slower this time to gently pet Izuku's hair like a kitten. The action was incredibly gentle. Izuku smiled to himself, both from relief and at how strange this entire situation is. The man took a curl in between his fingers, smoothing it from the base to the end before releasing it, letting it bounce back to its previous place. He was fascinated by Izuku's hair. It was odd to think a single strand of his curly hair would be such an object of curiosity, but in this circumstance, it was. As the man repeated this action a couple times, he began smiling, which eventually transformed into a full-blown belly laugh as he began bouncing excitedly. His excitement was contagious, and soon Izuku found himself giggling too, albeit quietly due to the weird tension. Something about the absurdity of it all was funny. Was this man really just that entertained by a simple curl? Suddenly, the man grabbed Izuku's elbow, pulled his arm up, and pulled down the short sleeve, staring intently at his underarm. He poked at the green hair donning his armpit, and rubbed his fingers across them. Izuku squeaked in surprise, squirming out of the man's hold and yanking his arm back towards his chest, covering his pit with his other arm and blushing heavily. The man looked at him questioningly, his eyebrows furrowing and mouth falling slightly agape. "I'm ticklish," Izuku exclaimed. He knew the man couldn't understand him, but explaining what happened was second nature to him. He blushed more as the man continued to stare in confusion. He lifted his arm, revealing his underarm to the man again, before slowly speaking. "No touch," he instructed, shaking his index finger disapprovingly as he pulled his sleeve up. Before he could lower his arm, the man grabbed his elbow again, examining the hair up close. Izuku instinctively froze at the forceful action, but technically, the man was looking and not touching. Suddenly, the man pressed his nose to his armpit, sniffing as he inhaled deeply, making a low rumbling noise that almost sounded like purring. Izuku gasped, his free hand reaching up to press against the top of the man's forehead, pushing him away. "What the hell are you doing?" he exclaimed. The man let go and cocked his head, apparently clueless as to what he'd done wrong. Izuku's cheeks flushed a dark red in embarrassment. He hadn't showered that morning, so felt incredibly self-conscious. The man lifted his own arm and brought it close as if offering for Izuku to smell him back. At first, Izuku didn't move, too shocked and grossed out at the prospect of it. But then it dawned on him that this was likely normal behavior to this brute, and he felt guilty for thinking ill of him for it. The man frowned slightly as the moments passed. So Izuku finally swallowed his pride and leaned forward, just to appease the man, and hesitantly breathed in the smallest amount possible, expecting the worst. To his utter disbelief, the scent was surprisingly sweet, almost like candy, caramel to be exact. When he pulled away to look back at the man's face, the man was sporting a pleased expression. "Does caramel even exist right now?" he murmured, mostly to himself. Without hesitation, the man seemed to resume his body hair examination, pulling the collar of Izuku's t-shirt down to reveal his bare chest. Upon not finding whatever he was looking for, the man appeared puzzled for a moment, looking up to meet the boy's gaze questioningly. Izuku narrowed his eyes, glaring daggers at the man. "Oh, were you expecting tits? Sorry to disappoint," he huffed angrily, hurt that even millions of years in the past, he couldn't escape the same form of bullying and accusations. I get it. I look like a girl. Very funny," he snarked. He felt humiliated. The man leaned back, seemingly intimidated, but kept his intense gaze locked with Izuku's, which annoyed him more. Finally, the man lifted the piece of torn hide that covered his chest and pulled it up to show off his chest, which was absolutely packed full of curly blonde hair. Izuku stared at those muscular pecs unlike any he'd ever seen before. Sure, he spent lots of time online, but none of the dudes there had anything this nice. His face felt warm all of a sudden. The man gave a toothy grin, his chest puffed out proudly at the attention. That's when it clicked. The brute must not have been insulting his manhood, or lack thereof, rather simply confused by the fact he was lacking hair there. He groaned, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his palms. He was overreacting. Izuku turned away, flustered. He needed to be more careful, assuming this man was the same as the people in his time. I'm a late bloomer, he explained softly. It was kind of nice to be able to openly share such an embarrassing fact, even if the person he shared it with had no idea what he was saying. Maybe that's why it felt easier to say aloud. Perhaps he could spill all his deepest secrets and confessions and the brute would never know and he'd get them off his chest without consequence. The brute reached back over to grab the hem of Izuku's shirt to lift it up, exploding his chest once more. Izuku instinctively covered his exposed chest with his arms and looked at the man, offended. Hey, he shouted defensively. In an instant, the man grabbed his wrist and began attempting to pull it away. After a moment of struggling against the strength of the man, Izuku surrendered to being uncovered. When he did, the man leaned in close, gazing down at the skin of his chest. Izuku took in a shuddering breath at the sensation, the proximity making him incredibly hot. Take a picture, it will last longer, Izuku chuckled nervously, wanting to say anything that would fill the silence. Something must have amused the brute, or perhaps he was just following suit with Izuku's chuckle, because he broke into a huge smile and erupted in loud laughter. Hearing the joyous sounds filled Izuku's stomach with butterflies. The man ran a fingertip across the flat plane of Izuku's bare chest, tracing an unidentifiable pattern, seeming amazed by how smooth and hairless his chest is. Before he could even halt the action, the waistband of his boxer briefs had been stretched away from his body by curious, calloused hands, and the brute peered inside. Izuku screeched, smacking the man's hands away and covering himself back up quickly with wide, alarmed eyes. The man blinked once, not appearing to understand why he was upset. He had definitely just looked at his dick without consent and now he was acting as if nothing happened. Jerk. He seethed through clenched teeth, shooting an irritated glare at the brute, who appeared surprised by the negative reaction. A soft noise resembling a question escaped the man. You can't just look at a person's dick without asking. Izuku snapped, unable to prevent the blush rising on his cheeks. There wasn't much more the brute could embarrass him about. You could at least buy me dinner first. Geez, he sighed in annoyance when he got no response, the man sitting frozen in place and looking unsure what to do next. Asking the man to leave and giving him a lecture would be useless and completely pointless. He needed to cool off. Forget it. With a sigh, he brought his knees up to his chest to wrap his arms around them, resting his chin on top. He could wait this out. Soon enough, he would be zapped back to the present and could take a nice, long, hot shower before going to bed to forget any of this ever happened. This was all just a big joke fate was playing on him. After a while, the man started cautiously shuffling closer once again. He inched nearer and nearer until he was in grabbing range, then moved even closer, carefully setting his hand on Izuku's knee. Izuku huffed, feeling too tired and overwhelmed to protest or even care about the invasion of space. Despite the man invading his personal space without his consent, he was still the most beautiful human he'd ever seen in person. He felt embarrassed at himself for thinking it, but the man's looks alone were drawing him to feel strangely safe despite everything that had happened. He somehow trusted the man hadn't behaved in such a way out of ill intent, but rather instinct and genuine curiosity. They sat in silence for quite some time before the man stood and disappeared into the forest. Well, that was the end of that, and suddenly Izuku felt more alone than he ever had in his life. He laid down onto his side and curled up into a ball, closing his eyes to try to pretend this wasn't reality. He cried softly as he began to drift off to sleep. He was awoken only minutes later by someone poking and nudging his shoulder. He jolted awake, terrified to find the source of the disturbance, before realizing he recognized that wild head of hair. Of course, the man returned. He was sitting cross-legged beside him holding what looked like a strange vegetable or fruit, of which one, he wasn't sure. It was unlike anything he's ever seen before. He reluctantly sat up and hesitantly picked it up and inspected it curiously, rolling it around in his hands. The man pointed at Izuku's crotch, muttering something unintelligible. Izuku grimaced and shook his head. I'm not showing you my dick in exchange for whatever the hell this thing is. Think again, buddy. He spat. Without a single expression or reaction, the brute left him to his own devices, but didn't move far, hovering close by, occupying himself picking at leaves and dirt. The thing reminded Izuku of a tiny cucumber in shape, but with the texture of a carrot and the softness of a peach. It was almost skin-colored, with darker veins visible beneath the thin layer. He wasn't sure if his mind was in the gutter or what, but he thought of how it looked suspiciously phallic. Mother Nature certainly had a weird sense of humor. Oh, wait, perhaps the man had a weird sense of humor. Was he saying Izuku's dick looked like this small, insignificant vegetable fruit? How rude. He glanced up at the man, who was pretending to be distracted, and narrowed his eyes accusingly. I'll have you know mine is much bigger than this thing when it's actually erect. Thank you very much, he hissed, and the man turned towards him quizzically, eyes landing on the object in question. Izuku's face burned as he realized his words had not been properly understood. He cleared his throat awkwardly and corrected himself. Never mind, he murmured, defeated. The man made his way over again, and before Izuku could react, he snatched the vegetable fruit away and tore a chunk out of it with his teeth. Izuku gasped, and the man's face split into a huge grin as he chomped loudly on his food, the juices dripping from his lips and down his chin. There was something so primal and enticing about the sight, and he didn't even know why. When the man swallowed, he opened his mouth and stuck out his tongue as if proving he'd actually eaten the piece he bit off. He then held it out, offering it back to Izuku. Izuku felt a warmth in his chest arising. This primitive being seemed to be showing him the food was safe to eat. He accepted the vegetable fruit, biting into it hesitantly, unsure of how it would taste. He moaned involuntarily as the sweet flavor exploded on his tongue. It tasted absolutely divine. It was akin to a candied apple, but also unique in its own way. He closed his eyes and hummed in appreciation as he took another bite. When he swallowed, he opened his eyes to see the man grinning and watching him intensely. He felt awkward being watched so closely while he ate. Maybe the man wanted more. He averted his eyes and held out the strange edible, offering it back to the man. He was being polite, but secretly, he did hope he would decline the offer. He wanted that delicious fruit all for himself. The man grabbed it from him, but didn't bite it. Instead, he held it up to Izuku's lips as if offering to feed him instead. Well, that certainly threw him for a loop, but he wasn't going to protest. He took another bite, careful not to nick the man's fingers with his teeth, his gaze locking with the man's eyes. They both stared at each other intently, making the experience 1,000 times more intimate than it should be. He shuddered slightly as he swallowed the chewed bits, breaking eye contact. It was too intense. He peered down at the last little bit left and hesitated, feeling slightly bad about taking the last of it, so he gestured for the man to finish it off. The blonde seemed to ignore the offer as he brought it back to Izuku's mouth. Izuku felt pretty excited he was getting the last bite. But as he leaned in to take it, the man suddenly pulled it back. Izuku paused, blinking in confusion. Was he being teased? He wasn't sure if he'd done something wrong, if the man changed his mind about it, or how to handle the situation, so he stayed put, waiting for the man to act. Suddenly, the man brought the bite-sized piece of food back to Izuku's mouth. Izuku hesitantly opened his mouth again, desperately anticipating the delicious treat. Just as he was about to lean in and claim his prize, the man pulled it back again. Izuku huffed, glaring daggers at the man, but was confused as the man glared back at him in what appeared to be annoyance. He'd expected the man to be laughing along with his immature teasing, but instead he appeared frustrated, eyebrows furrowed and jaw tight. "What's your problem?" he snapped impatiently, crossing his arms over his chest and raising one eyebrow. Did this barbarian expect him to beg for the last little morsel of his snack? He wasn't doing that. He wasn't that pathetic. The man, once again, brought the treat up to Izuku's mouth. However, Izuku didn't open his mouth this time, keeping mouth closed and lips pouty. Ironically, the man appeared pleased by this, which annoyed the boy even more. What was his game anyway? The man pressed the sweet delicacy to his bottom lip, rubbing it gently side to side, coating his lip in the sticky juice. Izuku was confused, but he didn't complain. He'd get to lick it off whenever this man was satisfied doing whatever the hell he's doing after all. He began rubbing Izuku's top lip as well, coating it evenly with the moisture from the food. Izuku wondered what the man was hoping to accomplish. When the man pulled it back, he paused before he ran his finger along the juiciest section, gathering up every drop, and brought his finger to paint a stripe on his own forearm and held it up, showing Izuku. It was anticlimactic, to say the least. Just a clear coat of liquid shining on the man's arm. The man huffed in exasperation, thrusting his arm in front of the boy's face. Izuku flinched. "I don't know what you want," he protested in frustration. The man pointed at the streak of liquid on his skin once again, and this time, Izuku's eyes followed the direction of his pointing, but what he saw this time was not the same. The liquid, possibly reacting to the heat of this man's skin, had a soft, rosy pink hue to it. He was mesmerized, looking upon this mysterious and incredible phenomenon. He looked at his own hands that had previously been coated with the delicacy's juices, noting they were stained a deep magenta color. He hypothesized that the liquid gradually changes color over time when exposed to something like oxygen, sunlight, or heat. Wait, Izuku brought his pinky finger up to rub some of the liquid off of his lip. And sure enough, on his finger was a pink, glossy hue, deeper than the mark on the man's arm but lighter than the stains on his hands. His breath caught in his throat in awe of what was transpiring. He had to voice his astonishment aloud. not caring there would be no intelligent response. Did you just use this as lipstick? He looked back up at the man, who had a blank look on his face. This man, who has likely never heard of makeup before. Izuku was afraid of scaring the strange man away, but couldn't stop himself from abruptly standing, beginning his signature pacing and rambling. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. This man just put this stuff on my lips, knowing it would turn pink. Does this mean he understands the concept of cosmetics? Does this mean that enhancing beauty using artificial means is an inherent instinct? Why did he even think to do such a thing? Maybe it had nothing to do with beauty. Maybe he thought I looked ill. I really haven't gotten much sleep lately. Would he try to add color to my cheeks as well? God, I need to write this shit down as a so many theories, so many tests and experiments to be done. Wait, he turned to the brute, who was still sitting in his spot and now looking slightly disturbed. That was to be expected though. No one wants to sit there and watch someone go into a mad frenzy. Do you have a name? The man stared at him blankly, obviously not understanding what he asked, or maybe not even hearing him over his earlier panic attack. Izuku muttered, trying to form the right words. He gestured towards himself. Izuku, he said, emphasizing the word for the man to attempt to repeat, which he didn't even seem to acknowledge. Izuku, he repeated with more emphasis, making it a point to clearly pronounce each syllable separately, gesturing to himself once more. When the man continued not to say anything or react in the slightest, he shrugged and decided to try something else, cupping his hand beside his ear, which the man imitated. Hear me, he said loudly. The man seemed startled before lighting up and smiling brightly. Izuku was confused by his sudden happy mood, until the man pointed to himself, then raised his hands to cover his ears before pointing back to himself again. That was weird. Izuku mimicked him, covering his ears just as he did, hoping to understand what the man meant. When his ears were covered, the man yelled loudly, startling him. Izuku quickly yanked his hands away and gave him a bewildered look. Ish, what the hell? He snapped, his heart hammering in his chest. The man just grinned, but that quickly fell into a more neutral expression and he pointed to himself again and covered his own ears again, this time yelling while he did so. Oh, Izuku finally understood. The man was indicating he was hard of hearing. He must have not heard Izuku introduce himself before. Izuku cupped his ear, gesturing for the man to do the same before saying slowly and loudly, Izuku. He pointed to himself once more and smiled warmly. The man cocked his head to the side before shouting, Deku. Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. The man had tried to copy what he'd just done, but had seemed to have misheard his name. He had to applaud the attempt. He smiled in amusement as he shook his head. He pointed to himself and enunciated clearly, Izuku. He placed his hand over his heart, nodding politely as he bowed slightly in introduction. Deku. The man shouted, his voice echoing through the forest, and he was quite proud of his attempt. Izuku sighed, defeated. He was probably wasting his time, but he attempted it again, speaking as slowly as possible and gesturing to himself, particularly his face, in an attempt to communicate to the best of his ability. Izuku. The man blinked at him, staring at him blankly for several moments before a huge smile split across his handsome face as he jumped to his feet, practically jumping in excitement. Deku, he shouted triumphantly. Izuku's shoulders slumped as he exhaled deeply in defeat. Close enough, he muttered under his breath. He stood awkwardly in silence and then smiled warily. It was silly of him to get so worked up. After all, this man didn't speak his language and was hard of hearing to boot. He couldn't fault him for struggling with his name. The man stepped closer to him, a bit too close for comfort, and grabbed Izuku's wrist, eliciting a sharp gasp. He looked at the man in a panic, as his thoughts immediately went to the worst possible scenario. The man unlatched the mess of hides and furs that covered his torso, letting them fall to the ground to reveal his perfect chiseled chest. He then pulled his hand forward to press Izuku's palm flat against his broad, muscular chest. Izuku could feel his heartbeat under his fingertips. He blushed furiously and chuckled awkwardly. Well, you certainly don't skip chest day, huh? He looked him up and down briefly. Or any day for that matter, he added. The man's body was impeccably sculpted and athletic. Katsuki, the man murmured, his low, husky voice reverberating in his chest. There was a guttural sound to the name, almost a growl, making Izuku's own voice catch in his throat. What did he mean? Was this what they called chests in his language? The man pulled Izuku's hand further up to rest on his cheek, tapping it in time with the syllables. Katsuki, he repeated. Oh, the man was introducing himself. He was telling him his name. Izuku felt like slapping himself. However, he knew he couldn't even attempt to imitate the harsh sounds in his name, so instead, he nodded. Chan, he muttered, trying his damnedest. He instantly cringed at his poor attempt. Katsuki frowned and grunted, sounding disappointed. Katsuki, he corrected. Izuku tried again, this time attempting to replicate the growling tone that Katsuki had, albeit much higher. Kacha, he trailed off, face flushed in embarrassment. The man kept trying to correct him and Izuku knew he was messing up. But the man made no moves to leave or tell him to give up. Frustrated, Izuku blurted out, "I can't say it, okay? Sorry, it's not like you got my name right either," he shouted indignantly, clenching his free fist and puffing his cheeks out childishly. Suddenly, the man released his wrist from his grasp. Before Izuku could comprehend what was happening, the brute lunged forward and tackled him to the ground, pinning him down. Izuku froze in panic, his eyes blown wide in horror as his mind raced, thinking of the awful things this man could do to him. "Katsuki," the man yelled in his face. Izuku whined as his head throbbed at the sheer volume the man was yelling. Izuku stared up into those fiery red irises and gulped. It had occurred to him in that moment how terribly small he was compared to this enormous, intimidating man. He trembled, heart racing. This was a frightening and dangerous creature. He couldn't hold back a whimper as he felt tears welling up in his eyes. He blinked before a full-blown sob racked his frame. "Kaken," he cried out, his voice muffled by the tears and snot. The man leaned his ear closer. "Kaken, please," he croaked. He wanted to scream, yell, fight, run, do anything to escape. Katsuki immediately sat upright on his haunches, straddling Izuku but releasing the death grip he held on him. He stared at him, studying his features intently with an expression of confusion. Izuku laid beneath him, staring back in fear and uncertainty. Had he accidentally insulted this man or maybe called him something terrible? He hoped that wasn't the case as the man hovered above him. "Kickan," the man shouted. Izuku flinched but didn't take his eyes off the man in fear of what might happen if he did. Surprisingly, the man simply patted his own chest, looking down at Izuku quizzically. "Kaken," he pointed at himself before giving Izuku a look that he assumed was supposed to mean he was waiting for an answer. Izuku blinked in confusion, but nodded hesitantly, wiping away some of the wetness from his cheeks. "Kaken," he squeaked out, voice shaking. Katsuki seemed to light up, grinning from ear to ear before bouncing excitedly, throwing his fists into the air and cheering, inadvertently crushing Izuku's pelvis in the process. "Kaken, Kaken, Kaken, oof, oh, shit, stop," he screeched, shoving Katsuki off of him. The man rolled dramatically and childishly across the dirt, giggling giddily as he finally stopped several feet away on his stomach, seemingly enjoying his new name immensely. Izuku rubbed the aching spots, knowing for sure he would have some nice bruises tomorrow. He groaned in pain and took several minutes to just lie there, holding his lower abdomen until the dull ache faded. He finally sat up and slowly moved to get to his feet. "Fucking Neanderthal," he mumbled, brushing the dirt off of his clothes and looking over to see where the man had gone. He looked around, but it appeared the man had disappeared. He wasn't positive if he was relieved or not as his body temperature was warming rather rapidly, distracting him. Or so he thought. "Deku," Katsuki said from directly behind him. He was startled by the noise, spinning around to find Katsuki holding out a relatively large, flat stone. Izuku reached forward slowly and gingerly grasped the object before pulling it towards him to get a better look. Upon examination, he discovered that there were various strange drawings and markings carved into it. It was fascinating. He studied the carvings intently and even flipped the object over to check both sides. The carvings themselves looked to have taken immense concentration and care. Izuku pointed to the rock as he looked to the other. "Kaken," he inquired, wondering if Katsuki was the artist of this impressive work of art. Kaken grinned, flashing his teeth as he grabbed his discarded upper body furs from the ground and wrapped them around Izuku, surprising him. Izuku yelped in surprise, struggling as the weight and bulk of the skin suffocated his already sweltering frame, causing him to perspire profusely. When the man let him go, he shoved the heavy furs off of his body and glowered in frustration. "It's a bit too hot for that, don't you think?" he said, fanning himself vigorously in hopes that Katsuki would get the picture. Thankfully, he seemed to as he didn't pick it back up when it was thrown to the ground. Instead, the man simply cocked his head and studied him. Izuku looked himself over, wondering what about him could possibly be worth staring at. He suddenly felt even hotter than before and felt himself begin to blush. He wiped some of the sweat that was dripping down his forehead with the back of his arm and glanced at his skin, finding it shiny with perspiration. He looked back up, finding Kaken was watching him attentively. This made it no less uncomfortable and he couldn't help the awkward, lopsided smile that spread on his face. The man had a curious gleam in his eye. Katsuki stepped forward, lifting a calloused hand up and gently ran his knuckles along his cheekbone, making his breath catch in his throat. His skin was soft but rough in some places. Katsuki used his thumb to rub against his sweat-dampened freckled cheek. His palm rested on his cheek, cupping his face as he rubbed the pad of his thumb intently across his cheek, as if attempting to wipe away something. "Oh," Izuku chuckled, leaning back slightly as he smiled shyly. Was the man perhaps fascinated with his freckles? Did he not see them often in this time period? They weren't exactly unique. Kaken stared at his own hand, appearing confused as to why the marks wouldn't come off. "Freckles," Izuku supplied. They're called freckles, Kaken hummed. He smiled, bringing his hands up to cup both of Kaken's cheeks and rubbing his thumb across his cheekbones. Freckles, he echoed softly though not perfectly by any means. Izuku felt his blood pumping harder in his veins. He started feeling faint, yet somehow energized at the same time, like a switch was flipped. Katsuki had shifted his hand to trace his fingers around the curve of his cheekbones before resting his index finger on his nose. Heat was building inside of him. He shuddered in response to the sensation of those fingers as they trailed lightly down the bridge of his nose, stopping to rest just beneath his lips. He closed his eyes and breathed heavily, attempting to keep himself composed despite being a trembling mess internally. This man was so handsome, it was unfair. He didn't want to be too bold or weird. After all, this man probably didn't even understand half of what was going on. Is it hot out here or is it just me? He asked rhetorically as he pushed Katsuki's hand away. He used the slab of rock to fan his face once more before it was grabbed away from him abruptly, causing him to flinch. His vision focused once again, and the man held it directly to Izuku's face as though wanting to show him the images. Izuku blinked dumbfoundedly, unsure of what the man wanted or expected. Kaken pointed to the carvings on the slab and Izuku found himself studying them again. It was almost like a Rorschach test. The way you read them was subjective, yet some images definitely stood out to him. He took the slab and looked closer, peering intently. He turned it various ways and squinted to try to make some understanding of it. Clearly, Katsuki was trying to tell him something. The heat consuming him was starting to affect his cognizance. But just as he was about to give up, he noticed a particular shape that stood out among all the others. It appeared to be a person but with scribbles adorning its ears. Beside it stood a large figure towering over it menacingly. He slightly turned the slab a bit to attempt to follow the scene. It appeared there were many large figures along with a smaller, but the smaller figure was crying. There was a large line separating the group of larger figures, like a barrier. Izuku gasped as he recognized it. It was very abstract, but rather unmistakable. His expression softened and he looked up at Katsuki sympathetically. Were you cast out by your people because you're deaf? Were you considered a defect? Is that why you're out here all alone? He wondered aloud solemnly. The man remained silent for several moments, his gaze becoming more serious as he covered his ears again as if confirming what Izuku had just asked. Izuku's heart clenched as he imagined how hard life must have been for this poor man growing up. His heart ached. He turned the slab around to examine the other side. An interesting shape immediately caught his eyes through all of the scribbled nonsense. It appeared rather phallic, making Izuku feel even hotter, but when he noticed the red staining surrounding it, it clicked together. It's the fruit, veggie, thing, Izuku gasped as he smiled victoriously. He followed the lines pointing from it, depicting various figures, presumably people, either dancing or fighting, maybe eating. Then, following another line to what resembled a baby, perhaps. If human, though, he couldn't tell. Katsuki, seemingly frustrated, snatched the slab away again, causing Izuku to grumble, but then he pointed to the center drawing, tapping it harshly. Izuku peered, squinting his eyes again, and sighed heavily. He was beginning to wonder how much longer he could endure this game of charades or if it was even necessary. Feeling the effects of the unbearable heat getting to him, the man waited impatiently and tapped the picture again when Izuku didn't respond fast enough, grunting at him aggressively. He grabbed Izuku's shoulder and pulled them both down roughly to sit cross-legged on the ground facing one another. He then took Izuku's pointer finger and touched it to the center of the slab before he began tracing circles around the drawings with their two joined hands. He had a fierce and intense expression, completely fixated and driven to make his point. Izuku observed the images with the utmost attention he could spare. What he realized was astounding. The images were not telling a story in a linear fashion, but rather a spiral one starting from the center. Izuku looked back up at him and then back at the image, unable to tear his eyes away. He could finally put the scribblings into some kind of cohesive story. Two people, one holding a rock and a stick. The next image, the opposite person is holding the rock and the stick. And so, the drawings continued. The people went to a place with many other people. They all shared the mysterious fruit veggie and danced together. Seasons changed over mountains and then the last image is of the baby. Izuku furrowed his brows. Katsuki pointed to the first depiction. Kaken, he exclaimed, pointing to the figure holding the rock and stick, which Izuku now realized was likely a bone. He moved to point to the next image at the other person now holding the objects. Deku, he declared proudly. Then, moving to the next image, this one was of the two people sharing food with each other. Katsuki was grinning madly as he pointed to it. Deku, Kaken, Deku, Kaken. He jabbed his finger back and forth between the figures in the drawing as he recited their names, sounding delighted. Was Katsuki some sort of psychic or something? That's exactly what happened. Katsuki had given Izuku a bone and a rock. Then, Katsuki moved on to the next drawing, pointing at the gathering of figures, but frowned. He furrowed his brows and scratched at it until there were only the two figures left. Then he pointed to the two of them, smiling. Deku, Kaken. Izuku felt a sympathetic pang in his chest. Katsuki didn't have anyone. Katsuki then pointed to the drawing of the fruit-vegetable thing before babbling a string of incoherent syllables and grabbing Izuku's hand, holding it up to Izuku's face as if reminding him of his magenta-stained fingers from said fruit. He nodded in understanding, smiling reassuringly. Yeah, yum, Izuku giggled. Katsuki smiled back, clearly pleased that he understood, before dropping his hand to trace his finger along the drawing with the figures dancing, scratching out all of the figures except 2 once again. The man looked up at him expectantly, as if fate itself answered all of his questions at that moment. He felt an insatiable pooling of heat in his abdomen, flooding every vein in his body. He suddenly felt unbelievably ravenous and his mouth was dry as hell. He licked his lips, feeling as if his throat was filled with sand. Oh, those figures weren't dancing at all. Izuku quickly yanked his hand away in embarrassment as he processed what Kaken was actually trying to imply, making his face burn an even brighter shade of red. Izuku tried to break the tension and distract himself from the sexy, shirtless, primitive brute staring at him and chuckled awkwardly. Wow, Mother Nature really turned up the thermostat? Huh, he forced out with a breathy laugh. He was sweating profusely and he felt lightheaded. He fanned himself again. As if Katsuki understood him, he spoke. Deku. Izuku looked at him and swallowed thickly when he saw that Kaken had been staring straight at him. He swore he could practically taste those gorgeous lips of his, and that piercing gaze only made it worse. Katsuki pointed to the drawing of the edible delicacy once more and then pointed to Izuku's now half-hard member that was beginning to strain against the thin fabric of his boxer briefs. Oh my god. Izuku yelled in disbelief before cupping his hands over himself as fast as possible as he felt himself turn 50 shades of red. He hadn't even noticed. How embarrassing. Oh shit. Katsuki wasn't psychic. It was clear now that the slab was depicting some kind of mating ritual, perhaps even marriage in their culture. The offering of the gifts could technically serve as the proposal, the gifts in which Izuku sort of accepted. Oops, perhaps that meant the gathering was a celebration similar to a wedding. Of course that wouldn't have taken place due to Katsuki being cast out from his people, so they seemed to have jumped right into eating the mystical fruit-vegetable thing which Izuku now theorized was some sort of serious aphrodisiac. Wait, did that mean Katsuki wanted to have sex with him? His mind raced as the cogs clicked into place, suddenly connecting everything together. To his dismay, his body immediately reacted to the thought, cock twitching eagerly in interest as he swelled within his underwear. Izuku sputtered and choked on his own spit as he attempted to swallow to soothe the dryness in his throat. He was panting and feeling hazy, overwhelmed by this sudden change that occurred in mere minutes. Shit. He jumped to his feet, but then stumbled a couple steps as his head began spinning. Okay, he whispered to himself. His body was trembling, still radiating with heat, and there was an immense pressure building up in his balls. He thought about the next couple of drawings. The baby. He can't have a baby. Does Katsuki know that? Maybe he wouldn't want him if he didn't think it was possible. He turned back around, ready to burst the man's bubble, but found Katsuki standing up several feet away, hands on his hips and a very clear boner tenting his loincloth. Fuck, that thing was huge. Izuku shivered involuntarily as he found himself drawn towards the sight of the delicious-looking organ straining against the animal hide, mouth watering for a taste. His awkward humor bubbled to the surface, trying to deflect his desires and thoughts. Wow, I bet you're popular with the... He stopped mid-sentence when Katsuki reached down and pulled the tie to untie the string that kept the flimsy fabric held together. At that moment, time seemed to slow. The world around him became nothing but background noise. All he could focus on was what was happening directly in front of him. It was just him, Kaken, and Kaken's magnificent cock as the beast swung out of the fabric, bouncing freely through the air. Izuku couldn't deny the overwhelming desire to feel that beautiful penis inside of his body, to fill him and stretch him to his limit. It looked so warm and soft but hard and pulsating with need. It was perfect. However, he couldn't possibly, no matter how much he wanted it. How long had it been since the last time he got any action? Years, perhaps. Sure, he played with the idea of hitting up a few gay bars, but it never happened. He had gotten so wrapped up in his work that he completely forgot to keep his sex life active. Not to mention, this was a stranger. Some wild man whom he knew absolutely nothing about besides the fact that he was quite possibly the most beautiful specimen he'd ever seen. Izuku shook his head and began his signature rambling as he turned and walked away, determined to get as far away from this sexy specimen as possible before he made a mistake. Nope. Not gonna happen. Never. I don't know who you've been with and what kind of diseases you may be carrying, and I don't see any condoms laying around free for use. No glove, no love. And don't even get me started on lube. That thing isn't going anywhere near me without proper prep. At the very least, there should be lots of foreplay and tons of kisses beforehand. You might have eaten bugs or something for all I know. Plus, I'm sweaty and smelly. If you aren't turned off by that already, surely you would be by then. Plus, we are basically strangers. I don't hook up on the first Suddenly, something tripped him, sending him falling face first into a pile of leaves and sticks and dirt and various plant debris. He pushed his bottom half up off the ground with a groan and whined pathetically. It was a little too late when he realized he was in an awfully suggestive position, ass up with his back arched and his legs parted with his head on the ground. He snapped his head back to look behind himself to see what it was that caused his fall and saw Katsuki kneeling behind him, grinning like a Cheshire cat. Oh shit, did he do that on purpose? Before Izuku could react, he felt strong hands grab his hips and pull them higher in the air. He panicked and kicked back and tried to push himself off the ground, but suddenly his boxer briefs were ripped away entirely. Wait. No. You're too big. We need Lou, he yelped but was cut short when Kaken plunged his hot, wet tongue straight into his asshole, leaving no room to protest. His entire body was shaking, and the force of that thick muscle plunging its way inside made him cry out sharply and arch his back, pressing back against the pleasurable intrusion instinctively. Oh fuck, he moaned unintentionally before slapping both hands over his mouth, shocked at the sound of his own voice and the pleasure that had surged through his spine like a tidal wave. Katsuki was relentless as he thrust his tongue in and out of the tight hole. Izuku cried out into his own hands, biting his fingers and breathing heavily. When Katsuki paused briefly to tease his rim with his thumb, circling it slowly and pulling the skin around his pucker with it, his brain short-circuited. He removed his hands from his face and dropped his head back down into the forest floor, no longer having the energy to try and stop it anymore. He instead clawed at the earth desperately to cope with the barrage of intense sensation. He could not believe this was happening, but he gave in completely to his primal lust, surrendering all of himself to the man that was treating him oh so well. He'd never experienced anything remotely as good as what this man was making him feel. Katsuki immediately got back to his task at hand, plunging in deep once again to continue his relentless assault. After what felt like ages of the teasing torture of Kaken stretching him open with his tongue, he whined pleadingly. He needed more. Katsuki released him and sat back on his knees, catching his breath. He seemed to consider something for a moment before speaking again. Deku. Izuku peered back at him with glassy, half-lidded eyes. Katsuki's pupils were blown wide, and he was staring, concerned at the sight of his wrecked partner, chest heaving. Katsuki licked his lips as he eyed the mess that he had made of him. He seemed unsure as to whether or not to proceed for a moment. Izuku struggled to compose his own thoughts, but managed to come back to his senses. He sat up and turned around to sit facing him. Okay. Phew. Wow, Suo, first of all, I totally wasn't ready for that, and secondly, holy shit, that was amazing. Wow, yup, alright, we are doing this, he breathed out. Katsuki titled his head curiously before Izuku pushed him back. The man didn't realize he had fallen back until he was resting back on his elbows. His eyes widened and then narrowed, looking offended. Izuku chuckled softly. We called this foreplay where I'm from, Izuku purred in a low voice, surprising himself with his sudden confidence, and as he straddled the man, he lifted his shirt over his head and tossed it off to the side, exposing his well-toned chest and stomach. The action left him both completely naked, and his inhibitions thrown to the wind, along with the last bit of his sanity. The man stared up at him with such heat in his eyes it was almost frightening. But Izuku wouldn't lie. It was also incredibly enticing. Izuku bent down over his new lover to kiss him, pressing their lips together tentatively and tenderly. He wasn't sure if kissing was something they did in this period. Katsuki seemed a bit unsure at first but caught on quickly, and began responding eagerly. Izuku used his teeth to tug his bottom lip and ran his tongue along the soft flesh before pressing deeper, licking into Katsuki's mouth. After a while, he broke their heated lip lock to press their foreheads together, panting lightly as he hovered over the man. Fuck, this is like one of my Pornhub searches coming true or some shit, he whispered. Katsuki furrowed his brow, seemingly confused by the meaning of the words but unable to question it as he was too distracted by Izuku leaning down to run his tongue along his pulse. Lucky for you, I'm no pillow princess, he murmured against his neck before sucking and nipping at the spot. Katsuki seemed to like that as his arms came around to grip him tightly, holding him close. He then proceeded to alternate between nibbling and planting butterfly kisses all over the sensitive area, worshipping his Adam's apple and the junction of his collarbones. He tasted of sweat mixed with sweet berries and musk, and it was delicious. Katsuki growled deeply before pulling him up to recapture his mouth, the two melting into a battle of tongue and teeth and fighting for dominance. It seemed that the two were very much evenly matched, with neither party willing to yield. They were equals in this partnership. While they fought with their tongues, Katsuki gripped Izuku's ass cheeks hard enough to bruise before roughly massaging the tight orbs in his large palms. Izuku moaned loudly as his backside was kneaded and toyed with, loving the feeling of the warm and calloused hands working magic on his rear end. It was like Katsuki just knew what he liked. It was almost as if they were built for each other, destined to fit perfectly. Izuku moved to pepper kisses along the strong jawline before dipping lower to pay extra attention to Katsuki's sensitive nipple. He teased the soft, rosy buds, rolling and squeezing them with his fingertips before pinching them between his thumb and pointer finger, twisting slightly. The man let out a sharp gasp before arching into the touch. Pleased with the reaction, he kissed and sucked at one of them before shifting over to give the other an equal amount of affection. Katsuki whined and grabbed the back of Izuku's head, pressing him firmly against his chest with the motion. Izuku continued trailing his way down his lover's torso, mapping out every dip and curve of the muscular physique. "God, you're so fucking perfect. It's unfair," he whispered against his abdomen. Katsuki growled appreciatively. Izuku licked his lips in anticipation of the main attraction before settling himself between Katsuki's legs, taking the massive cock in his grasp. God, it was as pretty as the rest of him. "Do your people give head?" Katsuki furrowed his brows in confusion, clearly not understanding. Of course, he wouldn't. He shrugged it off before reaching his head forward to press his lips to the leaking tip. Katsuki jerked away reflexively, seemingly startled and wary of the act. Izuku chuckled and shook his head before whispering, "I'm not going to bite you," he reassured. He reached up and grabbed Katsuki's hand before bringing it to his mouth. "Here," he said before taking 2 of the digits straight into his mouth, sucking lewdly as he took them as deep as possible. He swirled his tongue along the tips and bobbed his head slowly and seductively, demonstrating. Katsuki watched, enraptured with the sight of his long and talented tongue and lips sliding over his fingers with ease. Izuku popped them out of his mouth and smiled up at him sweetly. "See?" Katsuki smiled a smile that could light up the sun. It made Izuku's heart do a backflip in his chest. This man, despite the rugged exterior, was just as vulnerable as any human was on the inside. It warmed his heart, and it made his stomach feel giddy. He felt a weird connection to this person, as if they truly understood each other on a different level. If they could develop trust without communication, there was no excuse for anyone in modern society. Izuku had his fair share of short, not-so-great relationships and flings, and somehow, nothing compared to the way this man was looking at him as though he had hung the moon in the sky. Izuku chuckled happily and squeezed Katsuki's hand supportively in his own before guiding it to the back of his head, encouraging Katsuki to grip it. He lowered his gaze back to his throbbing member, eager to worship his perfect cock. He leaned down and placed a wet kiss on the head before licking the shaft. He stroked the base firmly with his right hand as he pressed another sloppy kiss to the slit at the top before wrapping his lips around the uncut tip. This was the biggest cock he'd ever put his hands on, so he knew taking it all in at once would be impossible. No, he wanted to take his time to savor this rare treat. He licked around the tip, humming at the taste of his precum before diving down to meet his fist and hollowing out his cheeks. The low moan that escaped Katsuki's lips sounded sinful, and damn near made Izuku come on the spot. He wasn't surprised by the fact he was probably super pent up, considering he was likely forced into celibacy after being cast away from his people. Oh well, their loss and Izuku's gain. Izuku sucked harder and began to bob his head as fast as he could, keeping up a steady pace of speed with his fist. He loved the taste, and how it hit his gag reflex in the back of his throat. He was sure that if he could practice enough he could learn to take him all the way to the hilt without choking. But right now, he would have to settle for what he could handle. He could tell his efforts were paying off as Kaken groaned and moaned loudly, not even trying to stay quiet. Izuku could melt at hearing those sounds. He often complained to his friends that men aren't loud enough in bed, so having the most perfect man he's ever laid eyes on this vocal was music to his ears. When Izuku twisted his wrist just the right way to stroke over the sensitive vein on the underside, Katsuki grunted and involuntarily thrust upwards. The unexpected movement choked him, forcing him to pull off for a breath as he coughed uncontrollably. Before he could go back to what he was doing, Katsuki sat up and cupped his cheeks in both of his hands. He looked deeply into his eyes as he caressed him gently, thumbs caressing his freckled cheeks. "Deku," he breathed out softly, seeming to be checking on Izuku. Izuku stared into those crimson irises, panting and teary-eyed, before giving his best reassuring smile. "I'm okay," he confirmed. His voice was a bit hoarse, but he couldn't care less. He felt an overwhelming sense of affection wash over him. Most guys would have just grabbed his hair and fucked his face relentlessly, not acknowledging his gags. This made the experience all the more intimate and meaningful. Katsuki smiled back before leaning forward to lick the saliva dripping down the side of Izuku's chin and the tears running down his cheeks. It felt oddly romantic, especially considering this was a complete stranger. "Kaken," he whispered sweetly. He found himself getting lost in this strange but beautiful man as he sat in his lap, straddling his hips and staring into his eyes with a soft expression on his face. This man had him wrapped around his finger without even realizing it, and yet Izuku didn't even mind. For whatever reason, he felt drawn to him, as though they were meant to connect. Maybe there was something to fate or soulmates, after all. Katsuki then wrapped his arms around his waist, hugging him tightly and burying his face in the crook of his shoulder. "Deku," he repeated again. Izuku could hear the silent plea hidden within the sound of his name and nodded in response, confirming that he was okay and ready for more. Katsuki pulled back to look him in the eye and search for the truth in his words, seeming uncertain about the decision. Izuku's heart leaped in his chest. He smiled slyly. "Fuck my brains out, big boy," he purred. Though Katsuki didn't speak his language, it was clear that he understood the message he was conveying. Katsuki's expression morphed into one of sheer primal lust, pupils blown wide with desire. He bared his teeth and snarled like a wild beast, gripping his waist harshly enough to bruise. Izuku squeaked in delight, shivering at the feeling of such immense strength restraining himself from outright destroying him. Katsuki reached under one of his legs before flipping them over so that he was the one hovering over him. Izuku giggled at his eagerness, admiring his gorgeous body stretched above him. Katsuki ran his hands up his chest, raking his fingernails over his nipples. Izuku bit his bottom lip to suppress a whimper, wanting to buck up and grind against his hard and pulsing member desperately. The lack of physical contact and stimulation was becoming painfully apparent to his neglected erection. He craved so much more. Katsuki then used his hand to lift his thigh up higher, pressing it to the side as he leaned in closer. As he positioned himself to take aim at his hole, Izuku grabbed him and held him back, making Katsuki look at him with concern and irritation. Wait, he yelped frantically. "We need lube or oil or something. Please, I can't take you raw." "Not this thing," he explained quickly, and stretching. "It's been a while," he admitted as he squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head away in embarrassment, looking to the side. He reached between his own legs to gauge the situation. The man had been generous enough with prepping him with his mouth, but it hadn't been nearly enough to compensate for what was sure to be a painful experience without proper preparation. He didn't want to risk tearing or injuring himself due to sheer impatience. To his utter disbelief and amazement, his fingers slipped in far easier than he thought they would. He blinked his eyes in shock and turned his head to look at the man currently holding his thigh up high against his chest in his strong and secure grip. His fingers slid easily through the slick that coated his insides. There must have been something in Katsuki's spit, or maybe it was the aphrodisiac he had eaten. Fascinating. And convenient, too. He didn't waste another moment and took the opportunity to probe further, adding more digits and curling them, scissoring his fingers around, testing the stretch. It was perfect. Whatever the cause, he would have to do further research on this phenomenon and write it down later for future reference and study. He slid his fingers out with a soft squelching noise, leaving him gaping and aching to be filled. Izuku sighed heavily, catching his breath from the unexpected turn of events. He laid back and let go of Katsuki before nodding in approval. The man was practically shaking with excitement as he aligned his length with his entrance. He grabbed Izuku's other leg and pushed it up on the other side. Izuku was spread open and displayed vulnerably beneath him. Katsuki's thick, engorged dick pressed flush against Izuku's twitching hole as he leaned forward. Izuku let out a low, keening whine when Katsuki gripped the base of his cock before pushing the tip of it inside. He was still tight, but his ass yielded, welcoming the intrusion. He could feel every inch of it as the man inched deeper, stretching him to the point of ecstasy. Katsuki had the perfect thickness. It filled him up in a way that was both satisfying and borderline matinee. The man groaned loudly before bottoming out. It was obvious he was enjoying the feeling of his walls clamping around him like a vice. After he was sheathed fully inside, he stopped to wait patiently for Izuku to signal he was okay. How gentlemanly of him. He may be feral, but he was considerate and mindful of Izuku. That knowledge only heightened the emotional aspect of the situation. Izuku had never been penetrated this deeply before, but the sensation was nothing short of perfection. Izuku panted heavily as he pulled Katsuki down to press their foreheads together. He wrapped his arms around Katsuki's neck and shoulders before locking his ankles behind his back. They stared deeply into each other's eyes as they simply enjoyed being interlocked, bodies connected. He loved that this rough and seemingly fierce creature was so gentle with him. But it was time to shake things up. "I said fuck my brains out," he purred as he dug his nails into the back of Katsuki's shoulder blades, marking him. Katsuki hissed at the pain, but seemed to love it. The muscles in his neck corded as he pulled out almost all the way before slamming back in forcefully. Izuku cried out and threw his head back as he was rammed repeatedly, feeling the rock-hard girth drag along his prostate and pound deep inside. He tried to suppress the embarrassing noises coming out of him, but failed miserably. Every time Katsuki withdrew, Izuku clenched his ass tightly around him to try and keep him close, greedy for more of that delicious friction. It felt heavenly. Izuku had a habit of jumping to the task of pleasing his partner, forgetting to get his rocks off as well, whether by being selfless or just letting his insecurities and fears of rejection get the best of him. He wasn't worried about any of that at the moment. Somehow he felt that their intimacy was just as pleasurable to Katsuki as it was for him. If the sweat dripping off his face, labored breathing, and wanton moans escaping his lips were anything to go off of, it seemed that he was thoroughly enjoying their encounter as well. It was amazing how connected they felt to each other. In the modern era, sex was so impersonal and rushed, leaving little to no room for connection of the body, mind, and soul. All his partners had been selfish and all about the chase. With Kaken, it wasn't just fucking. It was making love. A deeper meaning lay just underneath the surface, begging to be acknowledged. It felt different. Despite just meeting and not even having an actual conversation yet, the two seemed to fit together perfectly. Each thrust rocked through their bodies and souls, bouncing off their bones and shooting lightning up their spines. Both seemed to know exactly where to touch to set their lover ablaze in the heat of the moment. Neither would admit it out loud, but they each longed to be liked and accepted for who they were, and they seemed to find that in one another. Katsuki didn't care that Izuku was awkward and spewed the most incomprehensible nonsense that even modern humans couldn't understand. Izuku didn't care that Katsuki couldn't even hear half of anything he said to him. Being around Katsuki was the most genuine thing he'd experienced in a long time. There was no facade of social expectations, no expectations of impressing anyone. Izuku had shown up here groggy from lack of sleep, in an old t-shirt and his underwear, and not freshly showered, and yet Katsuki had still desired him. It felt amazing. Katsuki shifted slightly to grab both of Izuku's wrists and roughly pinned them above his head, never faltering in his pace as he slammed his hips against his lover, balls slapping harshly against his ass. Izuku whimpered loudly at the sudden display of dominance and writhed against his hold. His cock was smacked against his own abdomen with every powerful thrust, drooling all over his stomach. If only there was a way to touch himself. However, Katsuki's strong grip remained firm. Izuku found he rather enjoyed being manhandled and controlled. Katsuki swallowed his words in a harsh kiss that stole the oxygen from his lungs. He moaned openly into the other man's mouth as his tongue met his. Their saliva mixed together as they licked and sucked at each other. Izuku desperately gasped for air as they parted briefly, but Katsuki didn't allow him a second to rest as he dove back in again. He bit his lip gently in warning and smirked mischievously down at him. Fuck. If you look at me like that, I'm gonna, Suddenly, Katsuki let go of his wrists before sitting back on his haunches. He pulled out and flipped Izuku effortlessly like a rag doll onto his hands and knees. He gripped his hip with one hand as the other wove in his messy green locks to guide his face down toward the ground. Izuku arched his back deeply before raising his ass in the air submissively, inviting the other man to take what was his. Katsuki shoved back in with a snarl and proceeded to fuck into him with animalistic passion. The sounds of skin slapping skin, their voices, and the whistle of the wind became white noise. Izuku cried and screamed unabashedly as he was penetrated deeper than before, pounding mercilessly into his core. The new angle ensured that Katsuki hit his prostate with every snap of his hips. His fat cock twitched inside of him as he was spread wide, pliable and needy, desperate to be fucked until he couldn't remember his own name. Izuku's eyes rolled into the back of his head as he fell into complete bliss, reduced to a quivering, moaning mess of a man. He could tell he wouldn't last much longer. Just as the feeling started to build up, he felt that familiar pressure building up in his lower stomach. He couldn't bring himself to use words anymore, and simply whined desperately. As if Katsuki knew exactly what he wanted, he finally released his grip on his hair and leaned down, covering his back and trapping him in a passionate embrace. He reached around and grabbed his leaking cock, pumping it rapidly while simultaneously pounding into him. Izuku thought to himself that perhaps his time machine hadn't worked. Perhaps he simply died and this was heaven. Oh god, Kaken. Fuck. Yes. Tears began to pour down his face as the sensations took over him completely and washed away his previous train of thought. All logical thinking left his brain as pleasure consumed him entirely. The feeling of Katsuki filling him up and taking him from behind while stroking his throbbing cock was too much. He felt the release of pent-up stress leave him in waves. And suddenly, he came. Hard. He shot ribbons of thick, milky cum across the grassy floor. Katsuki continued to stroke him through the entirety of his orgasm as his inner walls clenched tightly around the other's length. A few seconds later, Katsuki roared and grunted, releasing inside him as he sank his teeth into the crook of Izuku's shoulder. They stayed in that position, intertwined, and riding out their orgasms while they embraced each other for support. Izuku whined loudly as he felt his hot seed fill up his insides to the brim. It leaked out past his cock as he rode his high. Once they'd both reached completion and milked each other to exhaustion, Izuku collapsed onto his stomach, landing in his own puddle of sticky spen. Katsuki groaned softly as his sensitive member slipped out, releasing more globs of creamy cum that dribbled out past his red and puffy hole. It was honestly impressive how much the man came. Katsuki pulled back to sit on his haunches and stared down at Izuku's ass appreciatively. He then rubbed his palm slowly over his plush butt cheeks before kneading it tenderly. Izuku couldn't help but whine and push back into his large, calloused hand. Katsuki laughed childishly as he poked Izuku's swollen entrance, watching it quiver and open with every prod. Izuku hid his face in his arms and blushed wildly as he was displayed and toyed with. Katsuki, amused and intrigued, pressed his thumbs into his used hole and opened it wider. He watched as his release spilled out generously, trickling down the inside of Izuku's thigh. He seemed to panic slightly and hurriedly scooped the spillage up before pushing it back in. Izuku chuckled quietly at his concern and laid limp, allowing himself to be played with, even using his toes to brush at Katsuki's side teasingly. Once Katsuki was satisfied, he crawled on top of him once again. He straddled Izuku and covered his back with his larger body before placing soft kisses against the bite mark he had left. "Deku," he whispered huskily. Izuku sighed and closed his eyes in contentment. His body was buzzing as he basked in their post-coitus euphoria. Katsuki rested his chin on his shoulder as he wrapped his arms around him, hugging his lover protectively. Izuku froze momentarily and furrowed his brows when he felt Katsuki's member, still hard, pressed against his backside. Was he serious right now? There was absolutely no way he had anything left after the amount he'd already unleashed inside of him. He looked over his shoulder at Katsuki, and sure enough, that dark hunger still lingered within his crimson eyes. Before he could even react or prepare, Katsuki flipped them onto their sides, grabbing him by the waist and hiking his leg up. He shoved his heavy erection back into his abused and well-lubricated hole without warning. The excess cum from earlier eased his passage. Phew. Izuku gritted his teeth and buried his face in his arms, unable to think. He swore he was still coming down from his climax mere moments ago. And now, Katsuki was rocking his entire world again with relentless thrusts. It didn't take long for Katsuki to find the perfect angle, knowing exactly where to hit as he drove his cock deep inside over and over. His thrusting was rougher than before, but his pace was slower. At first, Izuku had considered stopping him but gave up soon after when his own cock reacted, hardening again. He may not be able to walk for a while, but so be it. This was worth it. He tilted his head back onto Katsuki's shoulder as he turned his head and kissed along his jaw. His eyes watered from being overstimulated to the point of pure bliss. He couldn't keep up with Katsuki's rhythm, but the other man adjusted to match his movements. Katsuki slid his other arm under him and held him by the throat. Izuku grabbed his arm, clawing it as he choked on moans that got caught in his throat. He could hear Katsuki panting and groaning against his ear as he humped his plump ass like there was no tomorrow. They lay there for a while, connected, bodies glistening in sweat as they made love passionately and fucked each other raw. Eventually, they managed to roll themselves onto their backs so that Izuku was laying on top of Katsuki's muscular chest. Katsuki wrapped his arms around Izuku's waist and sat them up slowly so that he was sitting comfortably on his dick. It was slow and sensual as they fucked like that. Katsuki bounced Izuku on his length as he rocked his own hips upwards. It was romantic and erotic, loving and lustful all at once. Izuku felt a tear slide down his cheek. His heart ached and sang for the man beneath him, but his brain was screaming at him to get his shit together and stop this. But his body, however, had already given into the feeling, unable to fight his instinctual urge to continue their passion and ride him for all he was worth. So that's exactly what he did. Izuku decided he wanted to take control. He desired to see his brute of a being writhing underneath him. He reached behind him to the best of his abilities to push Katsuki to lay flat on his back. Once he was fully laying down, Izuku peered behind him to gauge Katsuki's reaction. He seemed to be ogling Izuku's ass just as expected. Izuku smirked. "We call this reverse cowboy," he stated matter-of-factly as he positioned himself to grind his hips slowly and seductively, never breaking eye contact with the other man. "You can touch all you want," he suggested in a breathy tone. His suspicions were proven true when Katsuki wasted no time and eagerly grabbed his ass and spread it wide. He was mesmerized by his work, his dick disappearing into that slick heat with every descent of Izuku's hips. "Deku," he mumbled almost shyly. Katsuki was biting his lip, gazing at him with pure adoration in his eyes. It seemed he was enjoying the view immensely. And with that, the pair spent the rest of the day together, lost in one another. They fucked in more positions than Izuku even thought possible. Whether it was on the ground, up against a tree, or even in a nearby river. Izuku thought that his brain just might break from the amount of sex he'd had in a single day, but he simply couldn't stop. He came until he couldn't come anymore, and Katsuki seemed to have an unlimited supply of seed inside of him, never letting up. At some points, he found himself becoming extremely sensitive to the point of being uncomfortable. And yet Katsuki simply flipped them and proceeded to pleasure him into oblivion. The sun set slowly outside as they coupled. After what felt like a lifetime of whimpers, moans, and cries, the sun set and eventually, stars dotted the night sky, and the moon shined brightly, watching their lovemaking session unfold with rapt attention. Just before their final mutual climax, Katsuki and Izuku held each other's gaze, staring deeply into each other's souls. There were no words between them. All that could be heard were the sounds of nature, the chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the chatter of the wild, and their own voices echoing through the forest. Katsuki roared into the open air as he came violently, spilling his last reserves of semen deep into his lover. It was much less compared to his previous ejaculations, but it felt divine. It filled him to the brim and flooded out with ease, joining the rest of the pearlescent mess pooling between their joined bodies. Izuku trembled and sobbed, releasing his last few drops onto his lover's abdomen as he rode out his own orgasm. Not long after, Izuku shut his eyes momentarily but seemed to drift off as his exhausted body finally surrendered and succumbed to his desires. His lashes fluttered softly against his cheek. His walls continued to clench rhythmically around his mate's softening length. Suddenly, Izuku felt his entire body shift dizzily, and his vision blackened. "Oh my god, Ida," he heard a feminine voice yell out excitedly. "It worked. We got him. Quick, Todoroki, pull the lever. Close the portal. Now," a male called out. "On it," a different male voice answered. The sound of a large machine powering down rang through the air. There was loud ringing and buzzing in Izuku's ear before complete silence followed. Izuku recognized those voices. Those were his best friends and colleagues, Ochako Uraraka, Tenya Ida, Shouto Todoroki. He slowly cracked an eyelid open, but everything was blurry. When his vision finally came back into focus, he realized that he was laying naked on the floor of his lab, still caked in semen, some fresh, some dried. "Oh my god, Izuku." Ochako rushed to his side and knelt beside him, pulling him up by his arm. She helped him to sit up, but not without the sound of a loud, embarrassing squelch emitting from his rear. A steady stream of sperm leaked out of his abused entrance. He groaned from the sensitivity. Ochako yanked her hand away instantly as if burned before staring at it, disgusted and confused. "Ugh, you're all sticky. What is this scent?" She cut herself off mid-sentence, the light bulb inside her brain turning on and realization hitting her like a semi-truck. She gasped dramatically and scrambled away to stand, putting two and two together, understanding exactly what happened. Izuku grimaced sheepishly before lifting his heavy head and glancing at his three assistants standing around him in various states of shock. Ada had a clipboard in front of his face to hide Izuku from his field of vision. Ochako was intently staring away at nothing. Meanwhile, Todoroki was staring unabashedly and thoughtfully between Izuku's legs. Izuku then peered down, noticing his dick hanging pathetically limp against his thigh. He immediately blushed crimson and covered himself with his hands despite having been seen in full view of the trio. He caught Todoroki in his peripheral grabbing something from a small table before walking to his side, chuckling. "Calm down, guys. It's just a penis. It won't bite," he said monotonously before proceeding to drape a thin sheet over Midoriya's lower body. Once covered, he patted his head sympathetically before sauntering off back to the rest of the group. Meanwhile, Izuku still felt like a fish out of water. What the hell had just happened? No, he knew except what happened. His colleagues had found a way to transport him to the present. That meant the accident with the rat had somehow caused his machine to actually work correctly, leaving him in the past until he was purposely transported back to the present. That was amazing. However, did that mean that the perfect man for him was left in the past? Was Katsuki even real? Had he hallucinated him to cope? If he was real, that meant he'd never see him again. Could he try to replicate the scenario that caused him to jump that far back in time? Did he want to risk that for the best fuck of his life? What was Katsuki doing right now? What would he think if he woke up from that passionate rendezvous only to find Izuku gone? Would he think Izuku left him on purpose? Would that break his heart? Izuku knew he should have been more grateful that his friends had managed to get him back to the present, but at that moment, he didn't care. A pang of hurt struck him as his mood soured. Tears began to well up and fall from his eyes before he could stop them. There was so much to process, and he was honestly still too fucked out to do anything about it at the moment. He could barely comprehend it. Izuku suddenly felt the sting of reality sinking in as he stared into nothing. The time machine wasn't a failure. Katsuki had really existed and he had made love to him. And now, Izuku would never see him again. Even worse, Katsuki would never know why. "Awa, don't cry, Izuku," Ochako whined. "You're going to win the Nobel Prize with this one." She walked to him and knelt beside him, putting her hand cautiously on his bare shoulder, squeezing gently. Izuku looked down at his thighs where his hands clutched the cloth covering them. Ada made his way over to kneel beside her. "That is only if we can figure out all the bugs and..." He gestured toward Izuku, struggling for words. "Get these odd side effects under control," he chuckled lightly, hoping to make Izuku feel less embarrassed. There was a pause. And then Todoroki joined them, kneeling with the group. "What do we do about that side effect?" he asked sincerely, pointing over to Izuku's desk several feet away. Everyone's line of sight trailed in the direction Todoroki motioned towards, their mouths falling open simultaneously at what they saw. There, crouched under the desk, was none other than Katsuki, the primitive brute, but naked, his fangs bared in a snarl, eyes wild with adrenaline, hair looking as if he just rolled out of bed after a good fuck. He was poised for attack, ready to pounce on anyone who threatened him. He stared directly at them as if daring them to come hear him. Holy shit, Achako yelled as she immediately stood up and backed away. What the hell is that? Ada shouted as he, too, stood up, backed away, and adjusted his glasses frantically. Todoroki remained where he knelt, seemingly fascinated as he observed the man. Izuku's eyes grew large and he choked on a sob at the sight of his beautiful barbarian lover. Kakin, he cried out with joy. He instantly sprang up to run to him, completely careless about his condition, the thin blanket slipping off as he got to his feet. Katsuki met him halfway in seconds, yowling ferociously, leaping to meet him as he swept his lover up into his arms in a tight embrace. Katsuki spun around several times and nuzzled his neck as Izuku wrapped his legs around his waist, sobbing happily into his chest. They looked quite obscene, naked, bruised, dirty, and covered in drying fluids and bits of grass. Once Katsuki finished greeting his beloved, he stared daggers at the gawking spectators of their reunion, snarling at them loudly. The humans yelped in fear and quickly scurried off to hide behind nearby counters and cabinets. "Nah, Kakin, bad boy. These are my friends," Izuku scolded playfully. Katsuki whimpered lowly and buried his face into his shoulder. "Deku," he breathed heavily, as everyone processed the situation. Ida poked his head up from his hiding spot behind a counter. "What's Deku?" Todoroki popped out from a shelf. "So I take it calling security would be unnecessary." Achako sprung up from behind a counter. "Izuku, who is this?" Her brows knitted in confusion. Izuku blushed sheepishly. He sighed before glancing over his shoulder. He could only imagine the view the others were getting. "Guys, this is Kakin," he introduced quietly as his blush darkened and he tightened his legs around the other man. Katsuki buried his face deeper into his shoulder at the mention of his name, mumbling something incoherent. Izuku spotted the bite mark from their passionate lovemaking out of the corner of his eye. The wound was fresh, swollen, and purple, and in the shape of the other man's teeth. He remembered reading about those during his studies. Apparently, it was common for some people to claim their lifelong mates by biting them as a way of staking ownership over the other. Katsuki had clearly laid claim to him, marking his territory. It made his heart swell knowing that Katsuki thought he was his and his alone, but Izuku completely accepted it. I think he's my husband." Izuku chuckled awkwardly, a little unsure himself. All eyes were on him. He glanced down to the floor as he scratched his cheek nervously. "What?" The three all shouted in unison. Izuku and Katsuki laughed aloud joyously. Their happiness could be felt radiating through the laboratory. Izuku couldn't believe his life had changed so drastically over such a short time span, and yet he wasn't complaining. Everything happened for a reason and he trusted his intuition wholeheartedly. He also trusted fate. Fate was funny like that. He couldn't wait to tell his friends every little detail. More importantly, he couldn't wait to teach Katsuki all about modern society, how to speak his language, read, and write. He could probably even learn Katsuki's native tongue. Oh, there was just so much information to discover. And maybe, just maybe, if it worked, he could try to recreate the accident with his machine that accidentally sent him to the caveman era, and then he and Katsuki could go visit. Oh yes, it seemed Izuku finally understood his purpose in life. This was where he truly belonged. Here, with the man of his dreams. His mind raced with endless ideas, scenarios, and opportunities. He turned back to look into the eyes of the man whom he didn't even know he had been waiting for his entire life, smiling brightly with hope, eagerness, and newfound purpose. He had so much to do, but at the top of the list was definitely showering and buying lube. Lots and lots of lube. Who would have thought that the past held his future? Certainly not him. But now, he couldn't envision it any other way. It was perfect. One thing no one anticipated at first was that being exposed to a being from a completely foreign location and era would put them at risk for God knows what. Thus, quarantine was required for all parties exposed. Katsuki, Izuku, Shoto, Tenya, and Achako were isolated and put into an undisclosed location and detained until further notice. This required them to go through daily checkups to monitor for side effects due to cross-temporal contamination. They all underwent several rigorous testing and exams and were housed separately from each other but in neighboring rooms with large, clear windows. As expected, Katsuki was having difficulties adjusting and didn't fare well being locked up and having strangers in hazmat suits, which were foreign to him, trying to poke and prod at him. On the very first day, a medical professional approached with a needle and Katsuki attacked them on instinct. It took no less than 7 armed guards and 3 tranquilizer darts to restrain the man as Izuku shouted and banged on the glass window of his room, begging them to stop. To make matters worse, Katsuki suffered from psychosis after the injection, likely a side effect of the serum they gave him. He acted irrationally, scratching furiously at the wall and then his own arms when he couldn't get through to his mate and yelling out incoherent babbles to communicate as best he could. Izuku's heart ached as tears streamed down his cheeks, watching him suffer and hearing his pained whimpers from the next room over, wishing desperately to wrap him up in his arms and reassure him. He'd brought him into this world. Now Katsuki was suffering, and it was all his fault. He couldn't stand by and let it happen, so he did the only thing he could think of, even if it meant sacrificing everything he'd worked for. The second day, when a physician entered Izuku's room, pulling a tray of supplies behind him to conduct more tests, Izuku snatched a pen off the metal cart and stabbed it deep into the scientist's leg. The man yelled out in pain and fell backward onto the floor, the cart falling back, stopping the door from automatically shutting. The door sat open with only the hydraulic hinges keeping it in place. Izuku knew this was his chance, so he grabbed the keys from the doctor's belt and bolted out to the door beside his own and unlocked it as fast as he could, letting himself into Katsuki's cell. His heart sank seeing the distressed blonde curled into a ball, completely naked and clawing at his face in anguish. He ran to him, enveloping the poor thing in his arms, rocking him back and forth as he pet him, cooing to him lovingly. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Kaken. I did this. Please forgive me. I promise I will fix this, I promise. I'm here. With that, Katsuki seemed to recognize him and wrapped his arms tightly around him, sobbing into the fabric of his hospital gown, sniffing at his chest, and mumbling Deku over and over again. Izuku smiled sadly, holding him tight, protectively, as he looked toward the doorway in anticipation, fully prepared to face whatever consequences waited for him beyond the threshold of the doorway. His friends watched from their rooms anxiously. Just as he assumed, men dressed in full body gear wielding rifles filed into the room, crowding the two men holding each other in the corner of the room against the wall. Izuku closed his eyes and took a deep breath, leaning forward to kiss the crown of Katsuki's head softly. He sat on his knees, hovering protectively over Katsuki, making sure that no one had a clear shot for a hit on Katsuki while he was so vulnerable and defenseless. If you want to kill him, you'll have to kill me first, and if you kill me, everything I know dies with me. Lest I remind you, I discovered 7 new, life-changing treatments to diseases ranging from dementia to depression, and I've created breakthrough technologies that are on track to save the planet. Think carefully before you act, gentlemen, he stated, as calmly, cold, and calculated as possible. He refused to be intimidated. In fact, he wasn't afraid, he was furious. There was a long silence as the soldiers thought it over. With a sigh, one of the guards pulled a radio out and spoke into it. Sir, Dr. Midoriya is out of confinement and with the specimen. What are your orders? Izuku felt Katsuki shiver in his embrace, shaking, breathing erratically, clinging desperately to him, obviously terrified out of his wits and cold. He'd never seen such technology and weaponry. To make matters worse, he couldn't understand what any of the people surrounding him were saying. Another moment of silence followed before someone spoke through the walkie-talkie. What are his demands? Izuku scoffed at that question. I already told you. We need to be together. He doesn't speak our language and he is hard of hearing so can hardly communicate as it is. He's never seen anything like any of this. Guns, electricity, strangers in helmets, machinery, glass windows, automotive doors, buttons, IVs, anything. He's overwhelmed as it is, but he recognizes me. He knows me as his mate, he admitted reluctantly. All I ask is that you let us share a room, just me and him. You can take more samples and examine us however much you want, but please let me stay with him. He needs me. The guard released the button on the receiver before there was silence on the other end. After a few moments, the voice on the other line spoke once more. Under one condition. Anything. Make him wear some goddamn clothes, the voice said bluntly. Izuku beamed in delight and burst into laughter with Katsuki in tow. The guards shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances between themselves as they wondered how this man managed to tame an actual wild beast from another time. Whatever he was doing must have worked. Izuku sighed and placed his lips on the back of Katsuki's head, whispering softly to him that it was going to be okay and that he wasn't going anywhere without him. Katsuki grunted softly in response, slowly calming down the longer he was enveloped by his partner's warmth and scent. Getting Katsuki into clothing was a bit of a hassle, but after a little extra patience and convincing, he was clothed in loose cotton pants, but still refused underwear and a shirt. He didn't particularly enjoy the pants and would tug on them, annoyed, throughout the day. At least they kept him somewhat decent in front of the numerous scientists and professionals who came in and out of their large shared room to evaluate them. That was unless he decided to pull them down to scratch his balls or pick the cotton lint from his ass while others were in the room observing. It was a work in progress. Izuku would laugh, reprimanding him lightly. But in the end, he just thought the other man was adorable. It was just in his nature, and he found it rather cute. He also found Katsuki to be restless and constantly fidgeting, which made sense coming from fighting for survival his entire life. He needed to move, to hunt, to use his strength. In this single room, there was nothing for him to do, so he went a bit stir-crazy at first. He wasn't accustomed to simply lounging around and not having to worry about fending for himself and looking over his shoulder every second. Katsuki had zero problems devouring all the food offered to him, even eating the paper plate before trying to consume the utensils he had no use for before being stopped by Izuku. They didn't provide Katsuki any utensils after that. Getting him to pee in the toilet of the adjacent bathroom and not the corner of the room was one of the biggest challenges. Thankfully, getting him to defecate in the toilet was far less difficult. However, he insisted on squatting on the toilet instead of sitting. Wiping was instinctual, much to Izuku's relief, and Katsuki seemed to love using toilet paper rather than leaves. He always looked so proud after he accomplished using the toilet. However, Izuku still had to flush for him as it scared him, fearing being sucked away into the pipes and drowning. On the fourth day of his sporadic restlessness, Katsuki picked up the habit of jumping up and down on the bed like a child, laughing wildly. To Izuku's dismay, that went on for a good portion of the morning. It drove him absolutely batty as he tried to document data on a tablet computer, but he refused to lose his cool. Eventually, the inevitable happened and Katsuki jumped so high he collided his head with the ceiling and fell backwards off the edge of the bed in a painful heap. Izuku gasped and rushed to him, kneeling down to see if he was okay. He couldn't help but chuckle at Katsuki as he sat up pouting, rubbing his skull. "Are you okay?" He parted Katsuki's hair to examine the damage. There was a bit of redness around the area he'd bumped, but otherwise, he seemed fine. "Ouch," Katsuki muttered, still pouting like a baby. Izuku gasped, covering his mouth. Katsuki just spoke word without coaching, actual understandable words that weren't Deku, Kaken, or Freckles. He recalled when Katsuki pulled his hair during their first meeting and how Izuku had said ouch. Katsuki had been paying attention. Perhaps he was more intelligent than he originally perceived and picked up things without being prompted to do so. He reached down and stroked the sore spot gently. "Ouch," Izuku echoed before grinning. "Bad Kaken," he chastised tenderly. "Ouch," Katsuki repeated, frowning at Izuku. He tilted his head curiously before pointing at the bed and uttering another word, "Bad." Izuku snorted in amusement, sitting down beside the other man and shook his head. No, the bed is not bad. Kaken is bad," he clarified, bopping Katsuki's nose. However, a little bump on the head wasn't going to stop him, so he popped right up onto his feet, sprinted across the room, and leaped onto the mattress, bouncing enthusiastically but being mindful of the ceiling this time. Izuku watched from the sideline, sighing as he sat on his own bed and continued with his data logging, giggling silently every time Katsuki laughed and mumbled Deku amidst his hollers of joy. It seemed as though Katsuki was finally settling in a bit, which was relieving to see. It wasn't long before the blonde started to get bored of jumping on the bed, so he hopped off with a loud thud and waddled his way over to Izuku, who now sat leaning against the headboard of his own bed. The curious caveman leaned over the bedside, staring at the device in the scientist's hands. He punched the surface of the tablet lightly, making Izuku flinch. "No, Kaken, no touch, remember," he exclaimed. He showed Katsuki how he typed out information into the device with the pen on the touchscreen. Katsuki appeared perplexed yet intrigued all the same. A frown creased his features as he studied the tablet. In true Katsuki fashion, he lost interest quickly, growing antsy. Izuku, intensely focused on work, ignored Katsuki, hoping to encourage self-exploration and learning. He didn't want to encourage codependency. Katsuki seemed to relent much to Izuku's surprise and relief and stepped away, running his hand over the surface of the wall, examining the paint texture, inspecting every object he could get his hands on, and knocking over an empty chair in the process before eventually getting distracted by his own reflection in the window to the adjacent room, Todoroki's, and touching his nose to the glass, looking for the source of the image. Izuku began reading a peer review study and got sucked in, giving it his undivided attention as he highlighted a paragraph here and there. He suddenly became very aware of how silent the room had fallen. Only the buzzing of the fluorescent lights could be heard. He looked up, glancing around the room in search of the noisy, hyperactive blonde, and panicked slightly upon realizing he was nowhere in sight. He jumped to his feet and quickly scanned the room. He set down his tablet on his bed and walked towards the bathroom to check for him, calling out his name in concern, but found the bathroom door wide open and dark inside. Where the hell did he go? They were locked in this room for security reasons, and he most definitely couldn't get past the electronic door on his own without Izuku noticing, so how had he disappeared? Frantic, the scientist dashed to the talkbox connecting his room to Shouto's and pressed the button, speaking through the mic. "You wouldn't happen to have noticed Kaken?" Shouto held up his hand, signaling his friend to stop talking. Shouto sat in a chair, facing Izuku's room, sipping tea with his own tablet in his lap. "Will you be quiet? I am watching Animal Planet," he stated, smirking. Izuku blinked, confused, and turned around to investigate what on earth Shouto was speaking of. They didn't have TVs in their rooms. When he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the empty room, he furrowed his brows and turned back around, pressing the button once more, baffled. "What are you talking about?" Shadow chuckled, amused, and took a sip from his mug before nodding toward Izuku's own bed. Izuku followed his gaze to meet crimson eyes as Katsuki crouched stealthily underneath the bottom of the bed, almost completely hidden except for those observant, piercing ruby orbs fixed onto Izuku. Izuku felt relieved momentarily until Katsuki, knowing he had been discovered, snarled lowly at the green-haired man, flashing sharp fangs warningly as he slowly crawled out from his hiding place. Izuku gulped, facing him, and cautiously inched backward until his back met the glass, pressing his hands on the surface flatly, wondering what in the world he was doing. Izuku slid his hand cautiously up the glass until he reached the talk button again, pressing it. "Shoo, what should I do?" he squeaked nervously, never taking his eyes off the predator that was currently prowling patterns on the floor, keeping his unrelenting glare on Izuku. Shadow hummed and swiped across the screen of his tablet a couple of times before speaking. "It says here you should either play dead or fight back." "What?" Izuku squealed quietly. "He's not a bear." Fine, he shrugged, sipping his beverage again as he read something else. "Maybe try punching him in the gills." "Gills?" Izuku yelped in disbelief before the sound of growling interrupted them. Izuku swallowed, straightening himself as he glared back at Katsuki, who had crept ever so closer. Shadow chuckled, and Izuku, still pressed into the glass, didn't bother looking back at him, too afraid to take his eyes off Katsuki, even if he wasn't within arm's length of him yet. "I'm glad you think this is amusing," Shui hissed under his breath, bristling anxiously. "If I die, you are out of a job, remember?" This only made Shadow's shoulders shake with laughter before he pressed the button and answered casually. "He isn't going to kill you." Izuku grit his teeth, feeling annoyance toward Shadow's lax attitude regarding this situation. "How can you be so certain?" There was a long pause, and for a second, Izuku thought he may have been abandoned, but thankfully, the intercom activated once more. "Pay attention, Izuku. You're staring at his eyes because you're scared. Read his body language instead." It's pretty obvious," he snorted before releasing his button and watching, amused. Izuku glanced down, watching Katsuki crawling on all fours along the floor as he made his way closer and closer to him. He certainly had that feral quality about him, and it would be foolish of him to assume otherwise. Izuku breathed deeply. He didn't mean to display fear, but he couldn't help it while being looked at like prey. He swallowed before taking a few more deep breaths to steady his breathing before exhaling through his nose. After several long seconds of intense staring, Katsuki made it within arm's reach. It was then that Izuku noticed Katsuki was subtly rocking his hips forward slightly, as if he were humping an invisible body beneath him. Drool pooled down the side of his jaw from where his lips were curled, and Izuku's stomach flipped when he noticed the snarl had transformed into something of a wicked sneer, and those blood-red eyes burned with unabashed lust. Oh, before Izuku could even react, Katsuki lurched forward, grabbing Izuku by the ankle to yank him forward, causing Izuku to squeak and fall on his ass, sending the air from his lungs in one big whoosh. Katsuki moved swiftly, pulling him forward until his back hit the floor, climbing on top of him, pinning him to the floor. A loud, throaty snicker bubbled from the blonde man, who grinned proudly down at his mate, clearly pleased with his little ruse. Of course, Katsuki would behave this way after getting comfortable in the facility. Izuku mentally smacked himself for not predicting the obvious outcome of Katsuki settling into his environment and relaxing from the stressors of previous days. Izuku also mentally chastised himself for finding what Katsuki had done so damn erotic. Now that the initial shock wore off, he allowed himself to acknowledge his position beneath Katsuki as he stared up at him, taking in his beautifully wild face with mussed hair. His eyes flicked downward, and he noticed Katsuki had somehow already come out of the drawstring pants he had previously been wearing and was now rutting shamelessly against his thigh. His cheeks immediately grew hot, staring back into that hungry gaze. "Kakin, Deku," Katsuki groaned huskily in a familiar tone. It sounded like a sigh of relief mixed with desire. Izuku looked up, registering an upside-down Shadow standing just at the glass, still drinking his tea and eyeing them with mild amusement. He gave Izuku a thumbs up before shutting the blinds, allowing them the privacy to finish their business. Thankfully, Ochako and Tenya's rooms were located across the hall, so they were blissfully unaware. The smaller male felt his chest burn with embarrassment and shame. Here he was being mounted on the floor by a prehistoric man in a room that smelled like a hospital, while cameras mounted in the corner of the room monitored their every move for research purposes. Not exactly the most arousing setting. But the weight of Katsuki's heated body on his, rubbing his bare erection against the fabric of his thin lounge pants, and the leering, wanting stare he was pinned by was enough to send a wave of pleasure up his spine. The hard, hot bulge of Katsuki's length prodding into his leg as he rocked his hips to grind himself on the scientist sent fire flowing through his veins, leaving him speechless and breathless. Still, he was a world-famous scientist and couldn't bear the thought of others possibly viewing him crying out while being pounded senselessly into oblivion by what others were referring to as Specimen 1A nonetheless. So he frowned and pointed in Katsuki's face. No, bad Kaken, he barked firmly. He most certainly hadn't told anyone what happened between Katsuki and him in Katsuki's era, even though his 3 closest friends and colleagues had most definitely already guessed. But he didn't need anyone else knowing their personal business. However, instead of the obedient retreat he'd hoped for, he got an obnoxious snort from Katsuki as he chuckled low, lowering his upper body, still rubbing himself eagerly. His large erection twitching against Izuku's clothed thigh as he growled lustfully, baring those razor-sharp fangs at his mate. Izuku froze for a second, swallowing a lump in his throat. He was both excited and nervous. The adrenaline pumping through his veins fueled him. When Katsuki reached his hands down to tug at his pants, attempting to pull them off his waist, Izuku smacked his hands away, huffing defiantly before placing his palms on Katsuki's chest and shoving him off with all his might. Katsuki grunted loudly as he rolled backward off of Izuku. Quickly, he scuttled forward, clambering back onto him and trying again, growling in frustration. Izuku shoved him off yet again, determined to assert dominance over the barbarian, not willing to surrender to his instincts any longer. Bad Kaken, he snapped again. Ouch, he reminded him, hoping he got the memo. To his delight, Katsuki faltered this time, pouting as he whined pitifully and backed off for a brief moment, looking upset. Izuku sat upright and took the chance to catch his breath, sitting up and moving away, pushing himself up against the opposite wall. Katsuki began to inch forward cautiously. He looked genuinely apologetic, seeming to have understood the implication behind his mate's disapproval. Kakenouch Deku, he whimpered sadly and pouted before sighing miserably. His head hung dejectedly, his usual pompous posture gone, replaced with utter disappointment at being rejected by his mate. Izuku couldn't deny it. Seeing Katsuki like this, defeated, left his heart aching. Katsuki didn't mean any harm in this, and Izuku knew he must have been so frustrated and sexually pent up with nowhere to release. This behavior was simply a natural, instinctual tendency. The green-haired man exhaled heavily and bit his lip, his eyes gazing up and down Katsuki's bare form, fighting the urge to throw himself at Katsuki, wrap his legs around his thick waist, and just beg to be fucked until he couldn't walk anymore. But he restrained himself, watching his counterpart with concern. "I'm sorry," he said, enunciating each word slowly, gesturing to Katsuki to repeat after him. "I'm sorry," he repeated, slower this time. Katsuki watched carefully, listening intently before glancing away shamefully. Sorry," he mumbled quietly. "Yes, good. Again," Izuku exclaimed. Katsuki seemed to focus for a moment, thinking and pondering before he spoke. He lit up at Izuku's praise. Sorry," he repeated a bit clearer, glancing away shyly, his eye catching on something. Izuku watched as Katsuki observed a bug crawling on the ground before springing into action, snatching the thing up and placing it in front of Izuku bashfully, reminiscent of when he had given Izuku the rock and the bone when they met. "Kaken, sorry." Izuku's mouth fell agape as he stared at the squirming insect on the floor, pushing back into the wall slightly. He was not a fan of bugs in the slightest, but Katsuki presented this to him as a peace offering, and the significance of it didn't slip by the scientist who realized this was Katsuki's version of a love letter. He couldn't help but feel butterflies in his belly fluttering like crazy. He looked up to see Katsuki gazing at him with such hope, longing, and adoration, and Izuku couldn't stop the smile that pulled at his lips as his heart pounded in his chest. Katsuki reached down and rubbed his still exposed erection shamelessly as he frowned. "Ouch," he complained. Izuku covered his mouth with his hand, stifling laughter. "It's called blue balls," he snickered, biting his knuckle. God, this brute was so crude and ridiculous, and so fucking endearing. He tried not to laugh at the pitiful look he was getting from the blonde, clearly confused as fuck, as he gazed at the swollen member between his thighs. Before he could say anything else, several armed guards dressed in riot gear burst in the door, and Katsuki recoiled defensively, snapping at them as they closed in on him. Izuku immediately jumped to his feet, ready to body block Katsuki from possible attacks like he did previously. But to his horror, Katsuki snatched him, slamming him onto the ground into a corner, and wrapped his arms protectively over him in the same way Izuku had done him when he was vulnerable. Katsuki snarled aggressively over his shoulder at the armed men surrounding them. Izuku knew he had to put as much of himself as he could between the guards and Katsuki's open target back, so he wrapped his arms and legs tightly around the other male's form to shield him as much as possible, shouting at the guards, "Stand down. Now, don't hurt him," he hollered desperately. "Put the weapons away. Step back. Now." The officers stopped, hesitating, before cautiously backing away from the pair in a half circle. "Dr. Midoriya, Specimen 1A was observed trying to assault you." We were ordered. His name is Kaken. Izuku cut off sharply, resting his chin on Katsuki's bare shoulder and stroking the back of Katsuki's neck soothingly. To his relief, Katsuki began to calm down significantly from the soothing touch. Though his body was tense with caution, his red eyes flashing between his mate's face and the guards. The position was a compromising one. Izuku felt Katsuki's cock pressed against his rear between his spread butt cheeks through his thin pants, and he blushed hotly as he tried to ignore it and continued to soothe the wary man in his arms. Izuku's own arousal was growing the more he caressed the muscles of Katsuki's broad back, feeling his sweat-slick skin as he held him in his embrace, clutching him tight. He ignored his own body's wants for the moment, needing to make sure Katsuki wasn't about to attack or be attacked. He's just frustrated. He meant no harm, he explained calmly, pressing his face into the side of Katsuki's neck affectionately, hugging him close. The officers hesitated before lowering their weapons. One reached down to activate their walkie, and the officer spoke into the device. Dr. Midoriya says Specimen 1A is not hostile. What are your orders? A woman's voice crackled through on the other end of the walkie. I am aware. We can hear everything on the monitors, remember? She sighed, sounding annoyed. We believe Specimen 1A has mistaken Dr. Midoriya as a potential mate, and we strongly advise separating them as quickly as possible. Izuku tensed at her words before shaking his head frantically. No, don't, he cried out to the guard, who was already reaching for a tranquilizer gun. Katsuki could sense Izuku's panic rising and began to growl aggressively at the guard as they drew closer. It's too late, Izuku blurted, clutching onto Katsuki desperately as he hid his face in Katsuki's neck shamefully, wishing they'd disappear. The guards halted and furrowed their brows in confusion. We've already he struggled for words, feeling a mixture of guilt and embarrassment well up in his chest. He means to say they have already consummated their mating process, came a deep male's voice suddenly from the talk box attached to the glass between the room and Shadows. Everyone turned to peer at the glass, seeing Shadow standing there, tablet in hand, a soft smirk playing on his lips, the blinds pushed to the sides. Am I correct? Izuku buried his face into Katsuki's shoulder, blushing wildly as he nodded his head in confirmation. He listened as murmurs went around the guards, probably gossiping among each other about him fucking some prehistoric dude or something, and it was just so embarrassing. Shadow closed his blinds once again, sensing his job was done. The woman spoke through the walkie. Figures, she muttered flatly. To say I am disappointed in you, Dr. Midoriya, would be a drastic understatement. Her tone sounded displeased. Have you no self-control or respect for your profession? Or are you perhaps having difficulties controlling this savage? Izuku's nails dug into the flesh of Katsuki's back. Not enough to hurt him, but enough to convey his annoyance toward the director. Very rich coming from someone who sucked off a professor in graduate school for a passing grade, he retorted spitefully. There was a silence that fell over the room before she finally spoke back. Touche, she admitted, chuckling lightly. I am send you down some products as we speak that may make the rest of your stay more enjoyable. However, I require a full detailed report regarding the consummation as soon as possible. I've emailed you the template. Return it as soon as you've completed it. Oh, and congratulations. Surprisingly, there was no mockery to her statement. Guards, stand down and return to your posts, she ordered the guards, who promptly saluted and began filing out of the room one by one. Katsuki's body relaxed once the guards were gone, but he remained cautious and alert, hunching his shoulders around his mate protectively, eyes watching the exit with a trained watchfulness. Soon, the door reopened, and an assistant walked in cautiously, making sure to portray submissiveness, with a small cardboard box filled with random supplies nodding their head at them before turning and making their exit. The door shut behind them. Katsuki didn't move, his arms still holding Izuku firmly. Izuku squirmed in his hold. Kaken, it's okay, he whispered gently into his ear as he lightly pushed his hands on his chest. Hesitantly, Katsuki let go, backing away so he could peer at Izuku with concern. Izuku gave him a reassuring smile before standing, stepping around and picking up the box left for them before walking over and plopping on his bed. He sifted through the things inside. A couple of extra towels, some toddler books, white paper, crayons, stickers, condoms, a vibrating wand massager, and one very large bottle of lubricant. Izuku raised his eyebrows, blushing as he stared at the assortment. Well then, he cleared his throat awkwardly. He glanced over his shoulder to see Katsuki sitting on the ground, frowning as he held something small in his hand, staring sorrowfully. Izuku walked over, kneeling in front of him, realizing he was holding the little bug he had gifted to him previously in his palm. It appeared to have been stepped on by one of the guards, and Katsuki was devastated. Kaken, sorry, Katsuki mumbled, and Izuku felt his heart break into pieces at the sight of him so broken and sad over a bug. How could anyone believe this man was a vicious, cold-blooded predator? Clearly, he had such a sensitive, caring, passionate nature underneath that rough exterior. Izuku placed his hand on Katsuki's knee, stroking it comfortingly. "You didn't do anything wrong, Kaken," he murmured quietly, sighing sympathetically. He held out his hand, palm facing upwards in a gesture of want, and Katsuki reluctantly dropped the carcass into Izuku's hand carefully. Izuku tried his damnedest not to shudder and grimace. He stood, nodding for Katsuki to follow as he crossed the room to the bathroom. Katsuki stood and trailed obediently as they entered the restroom. Izuku flipped on the lights and stood in front of the toilet, holding the dead critter over the bowl. He bowed his head respectfully. "Goodbye, friend," he said, feigning mourning. Then he looked at Katsuki intently with a soft expression, gesturing for him to repeat. Katsuki hesitated before bowing his head, too, much deeper than necessary. "Goodbye, friend," he imitated slowly. Izuku nodded approvingly with a soft smile. He opened his palm and tipped his hand, dropping the tiny corpse into the water. They both watched it drop into the bowl. A moment passed, and neither moved. "I'm going to flush now, okay," Izuku announced, glancing at Katsuki before reaching over to pull the handle, watching Katsuki haul ass out of the bathroom like it was on fire. Izuku snorted as he stepped in front of the sink to wash his hands. "Bad Deku," Katsuki grumbled loudly from the bedroom, where he hid behind the furthest bed. Izuku blinked in astonishment and sputtered. "Did you just bad Deku me?" He scoffed playfully, impressed, turning on the faucet. "Bad Deku," Katsuki repeated, glaring as he pointed towards the offending toilet angrily. Izuku chuckled, shaking his head as he lathered his hands. "I'm almost positive you could take down a bear with your bare hands. But you're terrified of a flushing toilet," he teased fondly as he rinsed. Katsuki clicked his tongue in annoyance. The scientist finished washing his hands and reached for the towel hanging up, patting them dry before tossing it onto the counter. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head. He crossed his arms and faced Katsuki smugly. Katsuki watched with intrigue as Izuku took a few steps back until the toilet was between them, making it where Katsuki would have to pass it to get to him. He gestured for Katsuki to come, but the man shook his head, glaring defiantly. "Oh, Kaken," Izuku cooed in a sweet, honeyed voice as he removed his shirt, and Katsuki perked up instantly, his pupils blown wide in arousal, eyes focused solely on the scientist. Izuku smirked impishly at how easy Katsuki was to tempt as he let the article fall to the floor. He hooked his thumbs in his pants and slid them down along with his underwear to his knees before kicking them off the rest of the way. He removed his socks and tossed them into the pile of discarded clothing and stood naked as the day he was born. He leaned his back against the wall and ran his fingers along his toned frame seductively. His emerald eyes locked with Katsuki's crimson ones. Katsuki's mouth was agape as he peered hungrily at Izuku's exposed physique, looking ready to pounce at any moment, his erection bobbing in front of him. "Kaken," Izuku purred lustfully, his free hand moving to stroke himself slowly as he tilted his head back, exposing his neck to the other man. He licked his lips and moaned. Katsuki looked like he was drooling at this point, eyes clouded with desire as he slowly emerged from his hiding spot, stopping right before the threshold to the bathroom. His red eyes flickered nervously to the toilet, then to the man touching himself. He seemed conflicted. Izuku knew just what may work to tempt the other over. He slowly sank to the ground, leaning his back against the wall behind him before opening his legs in an obscene invitation, continuing to stroke his now erect cock, letting out the filthiest moans he could conjure. He peered up to see Katsuki staring at his exposed hole, cock pulsing with need. Izuku felt his own cock throbbing in excitement. He'd never done anything like this before, so this was incredibly thrilling for him. Having someone stare at him so openly was so erotic. He spread his thighs wider. "Pleasey, Kaken," he whined desperately. With one final look to the porcelain threat, Katsuki sprung forward, rushing past it to his mate. Before he could pin Izuku to the floor, however, Izuku's foot shot out from below him, and he planted his bare foot right on Katsuki's sternum, causing the man to stop in his tracks, blinking owlishly at him before peering down at the toes pressing into his chest. Izuku gave Katsuki a serious look. "Flush," he ordered, pointing to the toilet trip handle. "Or no touch," he warned, gesturing to his arousal between his thighs. Katsuki frowned as he stared at the toilet, contemplating. Then his gaze returned to his mate, his eyes roaming over him hungrily, mouth salivating, and it looked like he was truly wrestling with himself. After several moments of internal struggle, he huffed in defeat and rushed over to the toilet, stomping on the lever forcefully, breaking it in the process, before immediately darting over to his prize, dropping to the ground hard, not even wincing. Izuku grinned earnestly, feeling proud. He didn't actually expect him to go through with it. It was cute how frightened Katsuki was of such a mundane thing. Katsuki climbed over top Izuku, eyes blazing with passion and lust as he glared down at the smaller man as though he were his prey. Izuku shuddered in anticipation at the ferocity in the red irises. "Bed," Izuku ordered, pointing to the bed, and Katsuki furrowed his eyebrows together, seemingly confused and taken off guard by the command. He tried to push his legs open, and Izuku giggled, smacking him on the head lightly. He pointed to the bed again, and Katsuki looked in the direction. "Take me to bed, Kaken," he said softly, giving him a small smile, finally seeming to understand part of the request. Katsuki growled before swooping down, scooping Izuku in his strong arms bridal-style effortlessly, and carried him to the bed. Izuku giggled the entire time, wrapping his arms around his neck as Katsuki laid him down gently, hovering above him on his arms. Katsuki pressed his face into the side of his neck affectionately, inhaling deeply, as though taking in Izuku's scent, before lapping his tongue along the curve of his jugular, tasting him. His cock leaked heavily as it bounced against Izuku's stomach. He leaned down, burying his nose in the tuft of green hair atop Izuku's pubic region and sniffing deeply. Izuku snorted loudly before falling into a fit of giggles before Katsuki peered up at him and scowled, unimpressed, before grumbling in irritation. Izuku snickered and brought his arms down, resting his hands on Katsuki's cheeks, framing his handsome, angry features. "Kaken is so weird, and so cute." He gazed at him warmly before gently pulling him up towards his face. Katsuki obliged, crawling upwards to meet his mate's lips in a searing kiss. Izuku's moan was muffled by Katsuki's insistent tongue invading his mouth. The two males kissed passionately, tongues twisting together in a familiar dance, teeth nipping and sucking. Katsuki pulled away, licking his lips. "Kaken touch?" he asked softly, almost politely, as he met Izuku's green irises, searching them hopefully for permission to continue. His pupils were blown wide as his crimson irises burned with hunger. Izuku let a slight gasp escape his throat, amazed. "Holy shit, did you just... Oh my god, you just asked for consent." "Why yes, Kaken can touch good Kaken," he praised, nodding enthusiastically, grinning widely up at him. A deep rumbling sounded in Katsuki's chest, something like a purr, as he ducked his head to press his nose into Izuku's cheek. It wasn't until his hips started grinding that Izuku snapped out of his awe. "Okay, wait," he said softly, pushing a hand on Katsuki's forehead, trying to prevent the blonde's attempt at entry without hurting his feelings or insulting him. Katsuki growled lowly but allowed it nonetheless, frowning with his eyebrows drawn together tightly, looking slightly troubled, as though he did something wrong. Here, Izuku gestured with his chin at the cardboard box of supplies. He nudged Katsuki up so he was on his knees over him, allowing Izuku space to sit up, which he did, and crawled to the edge of the bed to pick up the box and place it between them. He grabbed one of the bottles of lube, popped the lid off, and squeezed a small dollop onto his own 2 fingers. "Look," he instructed, showing Katsuki as he laid back and spread his legs wide before placing his fingers at his entrance. "Watch." He traced his 2 wet digits around the rim slowly in circles teasingly. Katsuki observed with unwavering interest and fascination. His mouth hung open slightly, drool collecting at the corner of his bottom lip. "This is called prep, so no ouch," Izuku explained, slowly beginning to ease one finger inside his entrance, wiggling it about as his walls clamped around it. He groaned softly, pulling it out before slipping it back inside once again, moving in slow strokes. Katsuki watched intensely before bringing his finger up, grazing over the hole currently occupied by Izuku's finger. Izuku halted, blinking. "Does Kaken want to try?" he offered softly, removing his finger completely and wiping it on the comforter. Izuku picked up the bottle of lube and held it out toward Katsuki, who just blinked, obviously confused. Izuku chuckled and shook his head. "Hand," he commanded, holding out his own hand palm up for Katsuki to hopefully mimic. Katsuki narrowed his eyes at him, clearly still confused. However, he relented, offering his hand up as well, and Izuku beamed, grabbing the man's hand in his. He poured some of the gel on Katsuki's large middle finger and used his own fingers to spread it evenly. Katsuki jerked his hand away and stared at the wet substance covering his fingertips. He stuck the tip of his tongue out and lapped at the lubricant curiously. Izuku snorted as he covered his mouth with a hand. "No eat," he cried, amused. Katsuki clicked his tongue in offense as he grimaced. Before he could wipe it off on the bed, Izuku grabbed his wrist firmly. "Here," he muttered, bringing his hand between his legs. "Touch Deku," he requested quietly, releasing his grip on Katsuki, allowing the male to do whatever he liked. Katsuki stared, entranced, as he slid his wet, lubed finger against the rim of Izuku's hole, causing it to twitch at the sensation. Then he carefully pushed inside, sinking deeper into the welcoming heat. Izuku gasped at the intrusion and arched his back slightly. Katsuki withdrew momentarily, worried he somehow hurt his mate. When there was no other reaction, he continued, his movements cautious. After a few moments of exploratory prodding, he hit the most sensitive bundle of nerves buried inside him. Izuku jolted, crying out in pleasure. Katsuki's crimson eyes snapped up, locking gazes with the scientist as they stared at each other, panting heavily. His pupils were so blown there was only the thinnest ring of red. Then suddenly, Katsuki removed his finger, holding up his hand to examine his finger closely. His eyebrows drew together tightly as he brought the finger closer to his face, nostrils flaring as he sniffed. "Don't do that." Izuku screeched, embarrassed, yanking the hand away from Katsuki's face. He could feel his skin heating up, a furious blush blooming across his freckled cheeks. This guy had absolutely no concept of shame. Suddenly, he was being pressed back down against the mattress as two of Katsuki's fingers delved deep inside his entrance roughly. It didn't really hurt, but it definitely wasn't comfortable, either. Where's that butthole loosening fruit veggie thing when you need it? He groaned. Katsuki made an inquisitive noise. Izuku looked up and saw Katsuki tilting his head to the side, eyeing him expectantly as his fingers continued probing and pumping. Izuku exhaled slowly. More lube, he managed to say after swallowing thickly and calming down. Gesturing to the bottle beside him, Katsuki followed the direction his arm pointed and reached over to retrieve the object, setting it on Izuku's chest. Izuku popped the cap off, pouring a little more onto his hole and Katsuki's fingers before Katsuki resumed thrusting his fingers. Okay, better, he murmured as he moaned, the drag of Katsuki's thick calloused fingers now a lot smoother. Katsuki growled and leaned down to nibble Izuku's ear, eliciting another soft mewl from him. He continued licking and biting along his jawline, leaving tiny purple marks along the way. After another minute or two, Izuku could barely take any more. Fuck me, Kaken, he urged breathlessly. Katsuki sat back on his haunches, cock-bouncing, and he yanked his fingers out harshly, causing Izuku to jolt. He then reached under him, shoving the pillows and blankets off the bed messily before hoisting him up easily into his arms. Izuku was suddenly sitting upright on Katsuki's thighs while the man laid back against the pillows, reclining slightly, holding him steady in his lap. He blinked at the man stupidly for a moment as his foggy mind struggled to catch up, attempting to piece together how they'd got in this position. Izuku placed his hands on Katsuki's shoulders to brace himself, and Katsuki wrapped one arm around his waist firmly while bringing the other down to position his leaking member against the lubed-up hole. He wasted no time lining his ass up over the large appendage and slowly sliding down the thick shaft. Fuck, Kaken, he babbled incoherently. The stretch was huge, much bigger than fingers, and Izuku whimpered as he felt his walls stretch wide to accommodate Katsuki's massive size. His toes curled, and he dug his fingers into Katsuki's shoulders, his nails probably breaking the skin. Katsuki rubbed his nose along Izuku's neck soothingly like some kind of animal. When he finally bottomed out, it was like something switched on in Katsuki's brain as he immediately began snapping his hips up violently. Though it startled Izuku at first, he couldn't find it in himself to care about the pain as the pleasure coursing through his veins clouded his thoughts. He threw his head back and shouted, clamping his legs around Katsuki's waist. Oh fuck, Kaken, Izuku yelled as his prostate was battered relentlessly. He swore he almost went cross-eyed a few times as he writhed helplessly in his mate's steely grip, unable to escape the overwhelming sensation. His body was hot and trembling as Katsuki's pace became frenzied. Both males lost in the carnal need to claim, rutting and grinding like wild animals. GNNGH, Izuku whined, drool dribbling down his chin as his tongue lolled out. He'd never felt this good before. It was maddening. Fuck yes, harder, Kaken, he screamed, his voice cracking at the end. He felt Katsuki shudder in response. A deep growl rose from Katsuki's chest, resonating throughout the room as he continued pounding up into the smaller man at a furious pace. With a final grunt, he shoved his nose under Izuku's jaw and bit down on his jugular. The flash of sharp teeth in pain, coupled with Katsuki's frantic thrusting, sent him spiraling over the edge, reaching his peak as he cried out in ecstasy. He felt his eyes roll back, spots dancing on the edges of his vision. Katsuki didn't stop thrusting even though Izuku was now practically dead weight on top of him as he chased after his own orgasm. After several more violent thrusts, he roared in triumph, pushing all the way inside before spilling his release into Izuku's clenching heat, cock pulsing and jerking. Izuku panted heavily, completely blissed out as he felt warm liquid gush into his channel, painting his insides white. Katsuki released his throat before pulling back slightly so the two men could look at each other. They were both drenched in sweat, breathing erratically, their faces flushed. Izuku's head fell forward, and he rested his forehead on Katsuki's shoulder, enjoying the sound of the blonde's heavy breaths blowing air against his dampened curls. There was a strange feeling stirring within him, something familiar and yet foreign at the same time. An intense craving or yearning, even. He wasn't sure if he ever felt this before. Deku, a deep, raspy voice cut through the silence. Izuku blinked owlishly as his head snapped back up to look at Katsuki. The man spoke. Deku, he repeated softly, staring at him with those bright red irises. He raised a large hand and wiped his thumb across a wet trail beneath Izuku's right eye. A soft giggle bubbled up from the scientist's lips as his heart soared with elation. Approximately an hour later, a group of students led by the department's head researcher was walking down the laboratory corridor. And this, guys, is our latest and possibly our greatest scientific breakthrough, the older male droned on as they stopped before the door labeled Specimen 1A. It's top secret, so before I show you, I must remind you that you all signed NDAs and must keep this project confidential until the board of directors decides to make a formal announcement about it to the press and other science-minded individuals. Agreed. A collective yes, sir, from the 7 students in front of him as he nodded before tapping the keypad code beside the door. The blinds on the other side of the large glass wall began to rise automatically, revealing a spacious room, as well as Dr. Izuku Midoriya Dagesta, stark naked on a bed, ass high in the air, with a large blonde man also fully nude draped over his back, fucking into him roughly as he let out shrill, keening cries. The researcher gasped loudly. My God. He quickly scrambled to punch in the code to close the blinds to cover the debaucherous display. He swallowed hard and cleared his throat before turning around to face the pale students behind him. Change of plans, guys, he said sheepishly, letting out a strained chuckle. 30 days in quarantine. Mine, Katsuki growled as he snatched Izuku's piece of bread away, dropping it on his plate before taking a bite out of his own. Izuku glared at him and huffed indignantly. Kaken, rude, he said, snatching his own bread back and tossing it back onto his plate. Bad Kaken. What did I say about taking without asking first? He scolded, wagging his finger in Katsuki's face as the caveman chewed his food, glaring right back at him. When Katsuki didn't answer, Izuku narrowed his eyes further before pointing to his lips. Apologize, he demanded sternly. Then you can have a kiss. Katsuki swallowed and grumbled. Sorry. Izuku frowned. Try again. K-A-C-C-H-A-N sorry. Katsuki barked impatiently. Izuku rolled his eyes, but couldn't stop himself from grinning, but gave his lover a sweet peck on the lips anyway, which he returned hungrily, trying to turn it into something more than a simple apology for stealing food. He chuckled, lightly pushing him away. No. Finish your breakfast, Kaken, he reprimanded teasingly as he waved his finger at the caveman. Katsuki had made leaps and bounds in his cognitive growth over the past month, surprising many of the scientists working with him as his vocabulary grew and he had finally agreed to wear a shirt. His biggest and, obviously, favorite coach was Izuku, having the patience and love for the blonde to keep teaching him new things with the items the lab continuously provided them. Through children's books, his tablet, and toys, Izuku kept Katsuki busy and taught him new words. Izuku even taught him how to draw using crayons and coloring books, encouraging him to practice whenever he got bored. He'd even begun learning sign language. Still, there was a long way to go for the blonde since he was quite stubborn when he wanted to be. And it definitely wasn't always easy to teach him, especially given that they weren't exactly allowed to leave the room they were confined to just yet. Although Katsuki knew several words and what they meant, he usually chose to act instead of talk, but Izuku was slowly teaching him how important clear communication was. Even Katsuki himself couldn't deny that his life was definitely better because of Izuku. For a long time, he lived in solitude with no one he could talk to. All he had to keep him company was his thoughts and actions, fighting, killing, and eating. Even though those were enjoyable things, there wasn't much thought put into it. It was simply what kept him alive. Now, he had his precious mate to protect and keep safe forever. One thing Katsuki still severely lacked was shame. He had no qualms about dropping true and presenting his cock as a means to assert dominance over the people in the laboratory. He regularly walked around completely nude when bored and waved his cock like a flag for absolutely no reason except for his own entertainment. Katsuki finished his breakfast, pouting that he didn't get any extra slices of bread for his meal. Noticing his expression, Izuku frowned. What's wrong? Katsuki grumpily muttered. Hungry. Izuku raised an eyebrow. You just ate, Kaken, he remarked flatly as he stared at him incredulously. Katsuki was pretty much always hungry, something he found amusing and annoying. He would constantly beg Izuku for food and snacks. Bread, Katsuki grumbled moodily. Izuku sighed. Your body is still adapting to digesting processed foods, love. You can't gorge on bread all the time. Remember what happened last time? Katsuki glared at him and snarled, annoyed. Of course, he remembered last time. The last time he ate too much processed food, his guts almost literally exploded, and he threw up and shit everywhere for hours. Still, he loved bread so much that it was worth it. He watched his mate silently eat from his meal, observing every movement he made. As if sensing his gaze, the human glanced up at him. He met those forest green eyes he adored so much. Those large sparkling irises contained infinite knowledge and kindness that Katsuki wanted to understand and know. He loved his mate so very much. Izuku took pity on his grumpy lover. Here, he murmured, handing him half of his banana. Katsuki's expression shifted as he happily accepted the treat and engulfed it whole, peel and all, chewing on it noisily. Izuku couldn't stop himself from laughing and dropping his head into his palms. This man was really something else. A few hours later, Izuku was lounging on the bed, reading on his tablet, while Katsuki sat cross-legged on the floor, working diligently with crayons and drawing paper. Suddenly, Katsuki held up one of his drawings. Deku, he called, grabbing his attention. Izuku looked down to see his mate grinning widely up at him, proudly holding up his drawing. In his hand, he clutched a paper depicting a stick figure with curly green hair, large green eyes, and freckles drawn all over its round cheeks and body, which was obviously naked, of course. A rather generously sized member was shown between the legs, along with green curls surrounding the base of it. Izuku blushed furiously as he snorted and started choking on his own spit. Katsuki's eyebrows scrunched together worriedly. "Deku okay?" he asked. Izuku tried to school his expression. "I am fine. It's just, I don't have 3 legs," he laughed, pointing at the illustration. Katsuki furrowed his brows deeper. He mumbled to himself thoughtfully, trying to figure out what he meant. Izuku shook his head, chuckling. "It's fine, Kaken. Thank you. That's a very lovely drawing." He smiled genuinely, showing off his teeth. Katsuki felt warmth flood his chest. His smile widened, and a light blush appeared on his cheekbones at the praise. Izuku went back to lounging on the bed and picking up where he left off with his book while Katsuki resumed drawing. After a couple of minutes, Katsuki stopped what he was doing and sauntered over to the bed, standing right beside it, staring down at Izuku with his intense scarlet eyes. Izuku didn't acknowledge his presence, too absorbed in his reading. Suddenly, a large, erect cock slapped his face, and he flinched violently. His eyes widened, and he looked up incredulously at Katsuki's smug face. "Kaken, manners," he squeaked. Katsuki cackled childishly as he grabbed his member and began hitting Izuku's face repeatedly with it. Oh, hey, Kaken," Izuku hissed, swatting it away. Katsuki grunted and kept slapping him with it until the other grabbed it forcefully, glaring angrily at him. He pointed threateningly. "Do that again, and I will bite it off," he warned. Katsuki's eyes narrowed, and he released a low growl, leaning forward, invading Izuku's personal space. He placed his hands on the bed, framing his body as he hovered over him. "Mean Deku," he snarled. Izuku couldn't hold his glare and broke into peals of laughter as Katsuki continued growling at him. "No, mean Kaken," he corrected. "I'm trying to read." He giggled as his lover climbed completely on top of him and began nibbling on his neck playfully. Izuku lightly pushed his head away. "Use your words, Kaken. Communication, remember," he reminded. Katsuki paused his biting to glance up at his mate. "Do sex," he stated, then paused to consider his choice of words. "Do sex to Deku," he rephrased. Izuku rolled his eyes. "Oh, wow, such a romantic. How could I ever resist such a compelling invitation, Kaken?" he said sarcastically. Katsuki gave him a blank stare in return, clearly not understanding the sarcasm. He sighed deeply, hating to turn down the request after Katsuki tried so hard to express himself to him, but he was so exhausted from having sex regularly for almost 4 weeks straight that his nether regions were more sensitive than ever. Plus, there were tests to complete soon to determine whether Katsuki could safely join society as a member of modern civilization. At no surprise, the entire country had found out about him and was waiting on word with bated breath. Izuku was beginning to feel the pressure weighing down on him to ensure Katsuki would be prepared as soon as possible to avoid unnecessary problems. Katsuki had taken everything he could throw at him with such gusto, seemingly great at anything he tried, and Izuku was starting to think the man was part machine. However, his stamina and insatiable libido were definitely far beyond that of normal humans. He also seemed to produce so much semen. Requesting a second bottle of lube was embarrassing enough, but requesting the third was positively mortifying. The couple didn't have sex every single day, but when they did, it lasted a very long time because Katsuki could easily reach multiple orgasms and often wanted to go for rounds 2, 3, 4, and on until he was completely satisfied. It was absolutely exhilarating and tiring at the same time. He insisted his mate reach climax as many times as he did as well at first, but it simply wasn't biologically possible for Izuku, being a normal, modern human and all, which took a lot of effort to make Katsuki understand that he enjoyed it. He just couldn't go as long as Katsuki could without serious pain. However, after he got the hint, it was much smoother sailing. Izuku pressed a small kiss to Katsuki's lips, and the blonde deepened it, sticking his tongue inside. It lasted several seconds before the pair finally parted. Izuku smiled at the sight before him, Katsuki, disheveled and flushed with lust. He ran his thumb over his lower lip, wiping some saliva off before giving him another soft peck. "I want to finish this chapter," he murmured apologetically. "We had sex 3 times yesterday. Don't you want to give yourself a break?" he asked softly. Katsuki's gaze burned intensely as he stared down at him, considering his words. Slowly, he leaned down and began licking up Izuku's neck. He could feel goosebumps spread throughout his flesh as Katsuki kissed and mouthed at his jawline. "Kaken," Izuku firmly scolded him, placing his palm on his broad shoulder and pushing him back. "I said no." The blonde pulled away with a frown, confused. Izuku realized he wasn't exactly clear in the way he coaches Katsuki to be. "Sorry, I didn't actually tell you no, but I'm telling you now. No sex," he clarified. Katsuki blinked owlishly at him. No sex, he repeated as if he hadn't heard right. Izuku nodded and patted his cheek lovingly. No sex, Kaken, he confirmed. Katsuki gazed at him intensely before releasing a huff of hot air. He grunted, pouting, as he moved off his body to lay beside him in bed. He was upset with a tiny twinge of anger mixed in, but he didn't do or say anything. Izuku bit back a laugh at Katsuki's petulant behavior, turning to face him, his elbow propping his head up as he gazes down at him with an amused expression. Oh, you're sulking, huh? He cooed, poking his cheek. Is this your first rejection? It must be really hard for you, Kaken, he teased. Katsuki swatted his hand away, grunting again as he turned to lie on his side with his back facing Izuku. Poor baby, he continued teasing with a soft chuckle as he slid in closer and snuggled against his back. He wrapped his arm around his torso, resting his palm against his toned abdomen. Ouch, Izuku heard Katsuki whisper after a few seconds. Izuku questioned, keeping his eyes closed. There was silence before Katsuki spoke again. Ouch, he uttered. Izuku lifted his eyelids and sat up. What is it, Kaken? He asked worriedly, gazing at the man next to him who was curled into himself on the bed. He noticed Katsuki's eyes were wet, tears forming in their corners. He made Katsuki roll on his back and scanned him over, noting his cock was still hard. Does it hurt? He asked, pointing to it. I didn't say you couldn't masturbate, Fluff. You can touch yourself if it hurts. Katsuki sniffled pitifully and shook his head as he wiped away a tear, avoiding eye contact. Izuku frowned. He was confused, wondering why his lover was upset. Kaken, talk to me. Can you tell me what's wrong? He asked gently, placing his hand on his thigh and rubbing it comfortingly. Katsuki finally looked back up at him, more tears spilling as he spoke in a broken voice. Deku no more love Kaken, he whimpered. Izuku's heart nearly burst at the declaration. Kaken, he breathed. That is so not true. That is not the case at all. He cupped the man's cheeks tenderly and rubbed away the tears with his thumb. Why would you even think that? The blonde squeezed his eyes shut again. Because Deku no do sex, he explained miserably. Izuku bit back a snicker, trying his best not to laugh. Oh, so you only want to be with me because we have sex? He teased, his lips twitching upward as Katsuki cracked open one eye and gazed at him warily. Is that all I am to you? A warm place to stick your dick? He grinned cheekily. Is that what love means to you, Kaken? Izuku prodded gently. Katsuki blinked up at him, and more tears escaped as he vigorously shook his head. He struggled to find words. Kaken what make Deku happy? Sex make Deku happy, he hesitantly confessed. Izuku felt like he could cry at how adorable this situation was, especially with Katsuki blubbering through his speech while attempting to articulate himself. His lover wasn't very good at expressing himself emotionally, and Izuku was still working with him on how to verbalize how he felt. His Kaken was such a kind and gentle creature, so protective and nurturing and sweet. He loved learning new things, and Izuku loved teaching him, seeing the excitement shining in his eyes and listening to him mumble under his breath as he colored. It warmed his chest every time the man tried so hard to be patient in understanding new concepts and making connections to apply them. His heart fluttered. Izuku laughed lightly and pressed a sweet kiss to his forehead. You don't need to be inside me to make me happy, Kaken. He blushed and averted his gaze, embarrassed by his own confession. Sure, he called Kaken love and let Kaken talk about their relationship as love, but had never outright said it yet or even admitted it to himself. He cleared his throat and glanced back, finding scarlet red eyes boring into his very soul as Katsuki gazed intently at him, eager for him to continue. Izuku took a deep breath before uttering shyly, I love you, Kaken. Tears welled up in his eyes before one slid down his freckled cheeks. I love everything about you. Everything we do together makes me happy. It doesn't always have to be sex. You make me happy just being you. Do you understand? He clarified, meeting his gaze. Katsuki's breath stuttered, and his heart nearly stopped at the words he understood. His Deku loved him. His chest bloomed with warmth and happiness, and he felt his eyes prickle as they welled with fresh tears. Kaken loved Deku. For big, he replied immediately, the sentiment simple. Izuku chuckled. I think you mean forever, Kaken. He wiped his own wet cheeks as Katsuki sat up and hugged him tightly, hiding his face in his neck. Izuku wrapped his arms securely around his waist. They stayed like that, embracing each other quietly for a few minutes. He had never felt so peaceful and content than when he was holding Katsuki in his arms. He became overrun with emotions and couldn't help but shed more tears as a result, letting out a quiet sob. Katsuki nuzzled his nose along the column of his neck and licked the wetness off his skin, prompting a soft giggle from Izuku. Why Deku sad? Katsuki whispered worriedly. Izuku sniffled and shook his head, pulling back to smile brightly up at him, displaying his pearly teeth. These are happy tears, he explained with a watery laugh. I just love Kaken so much, he professed, rubbing his thumbs against his cheekbones. Katsuki returned his smile, showing off his own pearly whites as he placed his hands atop Izuku's smaller ones. Kaken loved Deku biggest, he echoed. Izuku giggled again, and the two shared a loving kiss that lasted several seconds. When they eventually separated, both men were breathless. The pair leaned their foreheads against one another, simply enjoying the warmth of their embrace and their breaths mingling together as the moments ticked by. Well, this escalated quickly. Izuku snorted with a smile, closing his eyes. Katsuki scrunched his nose adorably and cocked his head sideways. I'll teach you that phrase later. After a short pause, he opened his green eyes and fixed his lover with an impish grin. Do you still want to have sex? He inquired, wiggling his brows. Katsuki's eyes shot wide open, surprised. He picked up the tablet lying haphazardly on the bedsheets and handed it to Izuku. Deku no done book. He mumbled softly, feeling guilty about earlier. He was actually willing to let him finish his chapter before doing anything. How sweet. The thoughtfulness made Izuku's heart swell, and his cock come to life. This man deserved to feel good. Oh, I can finish it later, Izuku insisted, taking the tablet and setting it on the nightstand. He grasped the hem of his shirt, quickly stripping out of it and tossing it to the side. Katsuki watched eagerly, and the moment he went for his pants, the larger man quickly reached forward to help slide them off, practically drooling at the sight of the half-erect member bouncing free as they were discarded along with the undergarment. He pushed his hand onto Katsuki's shoulder to make him lay flat on his back. He swung one leg over the large man and straddled him. Do sex, Kaken breathed out excitedly. Izuku smiled and giggled, leaning down to kiss him again, moaning lowly as he licked into his mouth. After a few seconds, he pulled back slightly, panting heavily. Have sex, he corrected before dipping down again. He sucked on his upper and lower lips separately, then together. Katsuki hummed happily, enjoying the attention. In the next room over, Shadow stood next to his electronic door in only his bathrobe to greet one of the guards who had been sent to deliver a package of things Shadow had requested that morning. Anytime a guard had to enter a room of one of the quarantined patients, they wore full riot gear just in case. He beckoned him inside and pointed to a desk he wanted the items placed on. The guard carefully put down the box as he spoke. You know, Dr. Roki, I'm starting to believe you request such random things all the time just to see me, he said lightheartedly with a hint of playfulness and teasing. He began taking items out of the box to double-check everything was accounted for. Shadow chuckled from behind him. And what makes you say that? He asked innocently, enjoying their usual flirtatious banter. The guard caught sight of a pink tube of strawberry lube in the box and lifted it. Well, this is new, he remarked with a raised brow and turned to look at Shadow. But his breath suddenly hitched as Shadow's robe hit the floor. Shadow stood completely naked and unashamed as he slowly approached him with his most seductive smirk, taking the tube out of his hand and pushing him out of the way so he could lean on the desk. He uncapped the lid and poured some on his fingers, coating them generously as he kept his eyes locked on his soon-to-be lover. I'm almost certain this is highly against protocol, Dr. Roki, the guard smirked, biting his bottom lip as his heated stare ran over Shadow's beautiful form. There was absolutely no way he'd turn down such an offer, but it was still nice to pretend that he'd try to protest. Shadow huffed a laugh. I never said you had to join. You can just sit back and watch if that's what you want, he commented as he crawled back a little on the table, raising his legs up in the air and spreading them so he had a direct view of his entrance. He rubbed around the outer rim. However, if you'd like to join, Sergeant Zero, I insist that you call me Shadow, he finished huskily. He licked his lips suggestively as he teasingly traced the outline of his pucker. Zero immediately removed his helmet and gloves, reaching to undo his vest as he strode closer to where Shadow lay spread eagle on the table, smirking widely, knowing he had made the right decision. Okay, Shadow, call me Hanta, he purred, pressing their lips together in a kiss as his hands roved over Shadow's body. He momentarily broke the kiss to ask, I gotta ask, though, what prompted this exactly? Shadow shrugged casually. It's been a long, lonely month of listening to my neighbors fuck like rabbits, and, frankly, it's not fair. I'm equally deserving of a nice cock to ride. Right? Why must I be locked in here all by my lonesome and kept from the pleasures of the world? He feigned hurt and innocence, batting his eyes cutely. Hanta snickered, shaking his head. You are something else, aren't you? He praised fondly. Well, lucky for you. I happen to have one of those. He smirked and wiggled his eyebrows teasingly as he undid the buckle of his belt, dropping his pants. Shadow shifted to get a better view of it, admiring it hungrily. So you do, he whispered breathily, feeling his whole flutter in anticipation, eager to be filled. Show me just what it can do, Hanta, he challenged with a flirtatious smirk. Katsuki came with a loud, guttural groan that rattled within his chest and spilled into Izuku's ass while Izuku rode out his orgasm on top of him, his own seed coating Katsuki's stomach, having reached his climax a few seconds after. Izuku moaned deliriously, rolling his hips as he milked his partner dry and felt Katsuki's cock softening inside. He knew it would stay there for a while now and collapsed forward, letting his body relax, tiredly nestling his head under Katsuki's jawline and kissing his skin lovingly. Katsuki carted his fingers through Izuku's tresses soothingly as they basked in their post-orgasm highs, catching their breaths. Their sweaty bodies were pressed close, and Izuku felt a slight draft coming from where the door had just opened. He registered that someone must have walked in right at their climax because he didn't recall hearing anyone. And more importantly, Katsuki hadn't reacted. He pulled the covers up higher around them to ensure their naked forms were covered before holding his hand out behind him to signal whoever it was to give them a moment. He took a few deep breaths and calmed his racing heartbeat before gently shifting off of Katsuki's member. The man beneath him shuddered pleasantly at the movement. Izuku could tell he was sleepy and used the pad of his thumb to swipe the beads of sweat forming on the dip of his forehead. As he stared softly into his eyes, "Love you," he whispered before placing a sweet kiss on his lips. Katsuki sleepily returned the kiss and replied, "Love Deku biggest." Izuku felt his heart jump wildly in his chest at the sentiment. He rolled over to sit up, keeping the sheets held up to keep himself decent and acknowledge whoever had entered the room, feeling embarrassed about having been walked in on during such a vulnerable moment. When eyes met a complete stranger standing a few feet away accompanied by a guard he knew well, he was startled and instinctively placed his hand on Katsuki's chest to keep him from bolting up and lunging to attack the stranger. He had gained a kind of trust with most of the workers by this point, but complete strangers were still considered threats. The man he didn't recognize seemed calm and professional, but Katsuki growled possessively upon seeing an unfamiliar face in their space, his demeanor immediately changing. "I hope you brought him some food or something. He doesn't know you, and that's the easiest way to earn his trust," Izuku explained calmly to ease the tension before turning back to his feral partner, speaking in a sweet tone. "Kaken, what did I say about growling at people?" he chastised lightly. "What do you say when you meet someone new?" he prompted. Katsuki squinted his eyes, staring the intruder up and down suspiciously before glancing to Izuku with a stubborn pout. Grumbling, "Nice meet Kaken," he reluctantly offered with a glare, conveying with his eyes how much he wasn't enjoying it. Izuku chuckled, ruffling his hair affectionately. "It's nice to meet you and I am Kaken, silly. But we can work on that," he reminded him and turned back to the visitors. The unknown man looked unimpressed and mildly disgusted by what he had walked in on and glanced at his clipboard with a slight grimace. "Good afternoon, Dr. Midoriya. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances, perhaps not in the throes of coitus with this." "Sir," the guard interjected uncomfortably, making him frown but promptly drop his statement, nodding once. "Apologies," he said with a stiff nod towards Izuku and cleared his throat, standing tall, appearing dignified. "I'm Dr. Nito Monoma, and I've come to begin assessing specimens 1A's social skills," he introduced professionally. Izuku nodded, remembering that Katsuki was set to begin these assessments that week. He had been briefed about it vaguely over the last couple of days but had since forgotten when the exact date had been mentioned. He wasn't expecting it until later in the week. It made sense, though. After almost a month, they'd probably want to begin seeing how Katsuki fared among people beyond the scientists, doctors, and guards. "Nice to meet you, Dr. Monoma. Would you mind stepping out for a moment? We should probably wash up before proceeding," Izuku asked sheepishly, laughing awkwardly. He felt Katsuki's hand creep down his bare back and squeeze his hip possessively, and he rested his palm on his arm to soothe him. Dr. Monoma gave them both an exasperated look. "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to disturb the sanctity of your lovemaking any further, Dr. Midoriya," he droned sarcastically with an eye roll. He had hoped to observe Katsuki from a distance sooner, but he supposed it couldn't be helped. He nodded to the guard, motioning for him to lead the way, and followed him out. Izuku blinked, unsure of how to take his behavior, but shrugged it off. He scooted closer to Katsuki and laid himself on his chest. "What did you think of Dr. Monoma?" he asked curiously. Katsuki wrinkled his nose. "Stupid," he grunted. Izuku laughed loudly, snorting, his shoulders shaking. "Now Kaken, that isn't very nice," he scolded teasingly. "Don't call him that when we talk to him, okay? You have to be polite and nice, remember?" he implored seriously and was met with another grunt of acknowledgement. They both cuddled comfortably as Katsuki idly played with a few curls of Izuku's messy mop of hair. "We need to shower. And we should probably change the sheets too," he grinned, tapping Katsuki's chin. Katsuki grunted disinterestedly. "Do sex," he bargained with a mischievous glint in his ruby eyes as his hand slid down to cup and squeeze his ass, making Izuku shriek in surprise. "Kaken, behave." He playfully swatted his hand away, sitting up, holding the sheet to cover his naked form. "They're waiting for us." He giggled as Katsuki latched onto his waist and nipped at his neck, tickling him slightly. "Kaken not done to Deku," he whined as he tried to tug the smaller man back down against his chest, his dick perking up in interest. Izuku snorted amusedly and wiggled to break free, but he had no chance against the strong force restraining him. All right, you naughty Neanderthal," Izuku relented, chuckling uncontrollably. "But let's take it to the shower," he suggested, and Katsuki stopped momentarily to think, his brows creasing. "Shower sex? Oh my god. You don't know what shower sex is, he realized suddenly with wide eyes and gaped at his lover, floored. He quickly pulled off the covers and jumped up off of the bed. How have we managed to fuck on every inch of this room but have yet to do it in the shower? Come on, he exclaimed, excited to share a new activity with Katsuki. Katsuki grunted and followed him into the bathroom eagerly. Izuku stepped into the walking glass shower and started the water, adjusting it to a nice hot temperature before beckoning Katsuki inside and closing the fog glass door behind him. Katsuki was still slightly wary of the foreign device that shot out water from overhead and always kept the door open when he was showering alone. It baffled him endlessly, and the first few times, he panicked and cowered away from the harsh spray. After realizing it wouldn't hurt him, he soon found enjoyment in standing directly underneath the warm current as if he could melt into it. He would always watch as the liquid poured down his body, collecting around his feet and swirling down the drain. He understood how to turn on the device without assistance but still had trouble adjusting the temperature, even slamming the handle all the way cold or hot. Katsuki wasn't one for self-control or moderation. Katsuki stood staring at the water cascading down Izuku's back in awe while Izuku wet his hair, the water droplets trickling along his skin tantalizingly. It made the muscles of his shoulders gleam as the light shone down on him, and Katsuki reached forward to run his calloused fingertips across the curves of his shoulder blades, entranced. His member was already fully hard again as he observed the gorgeous sight. He licked his lips as he admired the swell of his rear, trailing down his toned legs and back up again. Izuku smiled tenderly over his shoulder at him. You look as if you've never seen me naked before, he remarked, amused as he soaked his curls under the water. The wet tresses clung to his forehead as he slicked it back. Katsuki stepped closer to him, molding himself to his backside, arms circling his waist from behind, and kissed his neck lovingly. Kaken always wants see Deku naked, he confessed and rolled his hips to accentuate the fact. Izuku blushed, covering the hands resting on his stomach with his own. Pretty Deku, he drawled as he rubbed his face on his wet hair, inhaling his scent as his mouth ran along the freckles dotting his shoulders. Izuku's chest fluttered with butterflies, and his cheeks ached with how wide he was smiling. Deku more pretty than flower, Katsuki declared passionately and began biting and kissing the smooth flesh with fervor. Izuku exhaled breathlessly, moaning softly as Katsuki sucked on his skin like his life depended on it. Deku more pretty each day sun up, he continued, causing Izuku's heart to skip a beat. Kaken always want to see, he concluded earnestly. Deku mine. Izuku was almost moved to tears as he processed the pure honesty and sincerity in Katsuki's voice. He had never thought of himself as particularly attractive. At most, he believed that maybe he was somewhat cute. He'd had several partners in the past, and none of them had ever made him feel as adored and worshipped as Katsuki. This was no secret love confession. It was simply Katsuki stating his beliefs. He always wanted to see his lover's naked form and believed his body to be absolutely stunning and perfect in every conceivable way. He hadn't plagiarized those thoughts from poetry books or romantic movies. They had stemmed from his own mind. Though his speech was still broken, and he struggled to get his point across often, he was growing more and more confident with his vocabulary every passing day. Izuku swiveled in his hold so that Katsuki could read his lips over the sound of the falling water. He gently cupped his cheeks, stroking his cheeks with his thumbs as he gazed deeply into his vermilion eyes. You are the most beautiful person I've ever met, Kaken, he murmured ardently, the weight of his words apparent. Inside and out, Katsuki's brows furrowed as he processed what he had just heard. Deku not look inside Kaken, he countered, confused as to what that meant. Izuku burst into laughter, unable to help himself, resting his head on Katsuki's chest. Katsuki's confusion only increased tenfold. Inside Kaken read like Kaken eyes. Kaken protested, not understanding what was so pretty about a bunch of blood. Izuku shook his head, still recovering from his laughing fit. He placed his hand over Katsuki's chest, looking into his eyes lovingly. Kaken is beautiful here, he explained, pointing to his chest, and then moved his hand to point to Katsuki's temple. And here, he clarified, making sure Katsuki caught his every word. Whether Katsuki understood or not, Izuku wouldn't find out then as Katsuki's hands were quick to cup his rear and kneaded enthusiastically. Deku pretty here, he grinned devilishly, not bothering to use the word beautiful as he still struggled to pronounce it properly. Izuku squealed, laughing, as he was lifted up and wrapped his legs around Katsuki's torso, bracing himself on his shoulders and his back pressed to the tile, sliding his fingers through blonde strands and pulling him forward into a searing kiss. Their mouths danced in perfect synchronization, tongues meeting sensually between swollen lips. Katsuki gripped one plump-ass cheek in each hand firmly as he slid his cock into Izuku's entrance with ease, already loose and slick with seed from earlier. Izuku broke from the kiss with a gasp, a strangled cry leaving his mouth as he clenched his legs tighter around Katsuki's waist. Katsuki knew the routine now. Always wait for Izuku to tell him to move. Izuku rested his head back against the shower wall. his eyes half-lidded in bliss as he stared dazedly at the man above him. Katsuki looked as if he were silently asking permission. Even now, after all the times they had fucked before, he still needed reassurance that it was all right. "I love you," Izuku whispered tenderly, gazing deep into crimson eyes as if they held all the secrets of the universe. They were breathtaking and held a world of intelligence, emotion, and raw strength. Katsuki had been through so much recently, and yet he persevered, never backing down from anything. Not even a flushing toilet. "I love you," Kaken echoed back, clearer than ever before and without hesitation. Izuku's heart exploded, bursting with joy, as his eyes filled with unshed happy tears, lips spreading wider, beaming with more affection and devotion than any man before him had ever dreamed possible. Not to mention Katsuki had finally spoken in a first-person point of view. Katsuki leaned his forehead against Izuku's and began to thrust slowly in and out. He took his time, drawing it out, focusing more on the connection and intimacy rather than the speed or intensity. Izuku bit his lip momentarily, shutting his eyes tightly, basking in the warmth of the water pouring down, enveloping them. He rocked his hips in tandem with Katsuki, gasping softly with each slide and push. Their mouths were left parted in blissful rapture, the sounds of their moans and heavy breathing blending beautifully with the pitter-patter of the rain-like shower. Katsuki moaned lowly as his hips rolled upward to meet Izuku's body with each rock downward. He watched his expression with bated breath, always entranced by the look of sheer euphoria painted on his features when he was in the throes of pleasure. It was even more pronounced with Izuku's hair slicked back and the shimmer of moisture covering them from head to toe. A small stream trickled from Katsuki's hair into his eyes, but he hardly noticed. His grip on his lover's thighs grew impossibly tighter, digging his nails deeper into the supple flesh. Droplets caught on Izuku's thick eyelashes and dotted his freckles. He was ethereal, and Katsuki felt so humbled to even be allowed the privilege of witnessing such a spectacle. It almost felt wrong for him to be able to partake in something so sacred. He vowed to always worship the angel before him. They remained slow and steady, their breaths fanning each other's faces as they moved in unison. They would occasionally lean forward and lock their lips briefly or press their foreheads together, keeping the connection between them constant and deliberate, ensuring every point of contact remained present in some way. As Katsuki's thrusts became harder and faster, their eyes fluttered open, gazing heatedly at each other. Katsuki had to consciously force himself not to come the instant he saw the lust swirling and the green irises focused on him. He squeezed his eyes shut tight as his grip on the muscular thighs threatened to leave bruises on their surface. Izuku's legs tightened further around his body as his fingers dug deeper into the firm shoulders he was clinging to for support, crying out as Katsuki's cock repeatedly hit that perfect spot deep inside him. He whimpered, grinding himself down as hard as he possibly could on Katsuki's member, squeezing and clenching around him to create the best pressure he could. He could feel the heat beginning to build low in his abdomen, making his balls begin to tighten. Katsuki's ragged groans were becoming significantly louder, meaning he must have been reaching his climax as well. He had no qualms about being loud with their coupling and would often moan loudly until his throat went raw if he wasn't reminded to lower his volume. Izuku threw his head back as he felt a rough hand grab his dripping, leaking erection that rested between their stomachs. He opened his mouth, releasing high-pitched, whining keens, his walls contracting and spasming in ecstasy. With one last stuttering sob of relief, his jaw dropped, eyes rolling back as he released ropes of white onto Katsuki's stomach and chest. Katsuki growled as his orgasm was wrenched out of him immediately after, gritting his teeth to try to contain the near-animalistic yell that desperately tried to escape his lips. It was too late to bite it back, and his hoarse shout filled the enclosed space of the shower, reverberating off the walls. They continued rutting against each other with small thrusts, as they came down from their earth-shattering highs, panting and holding one another tightly in post-coital exhaustion and bliss. They both peppered each other's necks, jaws, cheeks, and any exposed area available with small butterfly kisses. Eventually, Izuku sighed heavily and untangled his limbs from Katsuki's, setting his feet back down on the floor and grabbing the bottle of shampoo to get started on actually showering. "Do you want me to wash your hair?" Izuku asked sweetly, knowing Katsuki still wasn't super fond of the initial gooey texture of shampoo. Katsuki frowned, snatched the bottle from his hands, and began squirting it into his own palm. "I wash Deku hair," he declared stubbornly, overpowering his aversion to the strange product for the sake of washing his lover's wild green curls, as he believed it to be his duty and responsibility. Izuku couldn't argue with that and was impressed Katsuki had spoken to him in first-person point of view once again. Such progress. "All right, but be gentle," he teased and earned himself a grunt and a kiss on his shoulder in response. Katsuki was initially very rough, causing Izuku to grimace and wince every few seconds, but after some stern lectures, he eventually settled into massaging the green hair lovingly, working through tangles and knots carefully. If that's how you do your own hair, I'm surprised it hasn't all fallen out by now, Izuku joked, laughing, and Katsuki shot him a sharp glare, snapping his teeth at him playfully in a warning. Okay, sorry, he snickered, squirting shampoo in his own hand to begin doing the same to his lover's golden spikes. Let me show you how it's done. He beamed, working up a good lather with a careful touch. Katsuki groaned softly as Izuku worked the suds in, scrubbing at his scalp gently with his nimble, deft fingers. He blinked drowsily as his head lolled forward, allowing Izuku better access, and was practically in a trance while his boyfriend thoroughly lathered the long locks. Izuku scraped his scalp lightly with his fingernails, running the bubbles through each strand in repetitive strokes, and Katsuki practically melted into the feeling as if he were about to collapse. When he finally did withdraw his hand, Katsuki made an indecent sound of complaint and disappointment, which prompted Izuku to laugh. Now you see what I mean. Izuku snickered as Katsuki huffed haughtily, pushing his head beneath the flowing water to wash off the foam. They both rinsed their hair and began lathering and scrubbing themselves with body wash to finish cleaning. Katsuki watched, bewildered when Izuku bent slightly and stuck 2 fingers between his ass cheeks, and proceeded to pump them in and out of his hole. He froze, perplexed as to if Izuku wanted to have more sex. When Izuku looked up and noticed Katsuki staring, he snorted, amused. I'm getting all of your cum out so it's not leaking out of me during your assessments, he explained, making Katsuki tilt his head quizzically. Asses, he echoed back, curious. He understood the word ass, but the rest still eluded him. It means testing. Tests? Izuku reiterated, shaking his head as he began wiping the rest of his body clean. You're gonna do great, he assured him with confidence. Just don't hit anyone, growl at anyone, bite anyone, pull your dick out, pee on anyone. Throw things at people, fart or burp while someone is speaking. Pick your nose, pick your ears, scratch your balls or butt, put things in your mouth, eat inanimate objects. He trailed off. Katsuki stared blankly at him, not completely processing half of the words he'd just heard. I'm kidding, Kaken, he giggled. Just be honest. Be yourself. You've come such a long way since we met. He praised lovingly and pecked his lips. This isn't a pass or fail test. It's just to determine where you are with your communication skills and level of comprehension. Just do your best. And if there's something you don't understand, just tell them, he added kindly, kissing the tip of his nose. Katsuki nodded seriously and kissed him back on his cheek. He wasn't worried in the slightest. He was good at everything. He could handle a couple of stupid tests. There was nothing that Katsuki couldn't master with effort, grit, and determination.